Story number 1. The Drunkard in the Empty Church. You're a kid, exploring an empty church building with your friend Holly and her cat Bubbles. The dusty halls silent under fading sunlight. I used to be afraid of cats. A loud slam echoes, followed by stumbling footsteps, then a slurring voice, growing closer, angry, wrong. There was no incident, no deep-rooted trauma, no anything I could or can name. You hide under a table, clutching Bubbles, heart pounding as the man's muttering fills the room. My mom hated them, never let me around them. He's close to too close, his words foreign, his presence a threat you can't see. And I suppose from there, ignorance spread fear. You escape, but his voice lingers, a shadow in the church that haunts your steps. When a stray feline wandered onto our driveway, I would let out a little squeal of fear and dart into the house. The churchyard is safe, but the building beckons. And that would be as close as I got. You're young, wary of cats, a fear inherited from your mom's disdain. I used to be afraid of cats until Holly, your best friend since 3rd grade, loves them, and her home is your second home. Holly and I spent our younger years together from elementary to middle school, 3rd grade to 8th. You sleep over weekly, roaming downtown, fearless and free. I slept over at her place every week, and we'd wander downtown from the local market to the nearby park to the city mall, each year going a little farther and growing in our confidence. One day, Holly's brother, Ajay, has a piano lesson at their church, and she convinces you to come, promising to introduce you to a cat. When we were 11 and 12, I slept over at her house as usual, watching horror movies until the wee hours of the morning and telling jokes we were too young to know. You'd rather play video games, but her enthusiasm wins. The afternoon came, and I learned Holly's older brother, Isaiah, had a piano lesson at their church. Her mom drops you off, and you explore the church's overgrown yard. Bubbles, a gray, weathered cat, appearing as Holly calls. Already a godless little heathen, I wanted to stay at their house and play smash on Isaiah's Wii. You pet him cautiously, warming to his calm as you wander the field. But Holly convinced me to tag along, saying we could play in their yard, and she could finally introduce me to a cat. The building hides danger, and you're not alone. I eventually agreed, and into the minivan we piled. Boredom sets in, and Holly leads you to an old church annex, rarely used, its bottom floor deserted. Her mom dropped us off and went to run errands. You carry Bubbles, his soft meows comforting, as you enter the dim halls, dust swirling in slanted light. Isaiah strode towards the main building, and Holly and I went trampling through the long grass. The building feels eerie, switches untouched, the dark thrilling. A row of houses laid on dilapidated property on the other side of broken-down fences. Holly assures you it's fine, her brother's nearby. But you should avoid being seen. These houses and these buildings lay beside an empty road. You reach a banquet room, tables draped with long cloths, and giggle, whispering, until a loud slam breaks the quiet. Stumbling footsteps echo, a man's slurring voice muttering in a strange tongue, growing closer, unsteady but menacing. Holly squatted down next to a hole in the fence and started clicking her tongue on the roof of her mouth. You freeze, Holly's face paling as she recognizes the words. I stared at her blankly for a few moments before looking towards the road. You dive under a table, pulling Bubbles close, his purrs soft but steady. No cars, no people, nothing. The man enters, his voice agitated, footsteps scraping linoleum, bumping walls. You hold your breath, trembling, praying he doesn't find you, his presence a shadow too close. When I finally look back, I see her holding a dark gray cat. The drunkard's voice chases you, and fear takes hold. Even my inexperienced eyes could tell she was older. You clutch Bubbles, his calm grounding you, as the man's muttering fades down the hall, and based on the unimpressive look on her mushy little face, she was probably accustomed to being picked up by children. Holly stops you from speaking, whispering, "Let's get out of here." Holly explained that this was Bubbles, who constantly wandered over to the field outside the church in search of food or butterflies or whatever else cats look for. You crawl out, tiptoeing down the hall he came from, emerging onto a dirt road. He'd been doing it for years, so being picked up by children was nothing new for him. You circle back to the field, heart still racing, the church silent again. In short, he was the perfect cat for a girl afraid of cats to try and meet. You don't tell anyone, fearing trouble for trespassing, and Holly stays quiet about the man's words. I let Holly carry him as we wandered around the field, occasionally leaning over to give him a tentative pet. You never learn what he said. Her silence heavy, the encounter a secret. When boredom, as it inevitably does, infected us, we set our sights on the building closest to us. You avoid the church, Bubbles your only comfort, his memory easing your fear of cats. It was technically a church property, and Holly explained that, but they rarely used it. The man's voice, his stumbling, lingers, a chill you can't shake. Some classes were held in the upper levels, but usually the bottom floor and entire building were deserted. The church stays silent, but its shadow follows. What were we to do? You grow up, far from that church, but avoid empty buildings. They're quiet, too heavy. 2 girls and a cat walked into a bar. You dream of the footsteps, the slurring, Bubbles purrs, and I forget how the rest of this joke goes. You search online, finding forums, kids exploring old buildings, hearing voices, hiding from strangers. So, we wandered into the building, Bubbles meowing softly, but not sounding bothered. A local mentions the church's annex, once a shelter, drawing wanderers, no clear history. Most of the halls were speckled with dust, sunlight filtering in through dirty and shuttered windows. You post your story, connecting with others who felt fear in deserted places. There are no lights on, and while we see switches all over the place, we're unwilling to turn them on. Replies speak of footsteps, mutters, buildings alive with secrets. Maybe we just like the creepy atmosphere. You live in a bright home, but check corners, avoid dark halls. But traipsing around like this is thrilling. The drunkard's voice, Bubbles came to stay, a scar, a lesson, wondering what he said, what he wanted in that empty church. Just when I ask her if we'll get in trouble for being here, she rolls her eyes and tells me to relax. Story number 2, the weight of the call. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of the dispatch center. A woman's voice, frantic, poured through, her words jagged with panic. Her sister was texting about a rope, a cemetery, her life ending. My hands trembled, my screen glowing with data, but the clock was a blade, each second a cut, and I was alone, racing to save her. The air was heavy. The night outside darkened, my headset a lifeline to a stranger's fear. I typed, called, pinged her phone, my voice steady but my heart pounding. M was out there, lost in a town too small, too quiet. Her words a map I couldn't read, a life I couldn't reach. I sent officers, my fingers flying, my mind replaying her texts. Cemetery, rope, home. The sheriff's radio crackled, their voices calm, but I felt it. A dread, a weight, a truth I didn't want. M was slipping, and I was her only chance, her last voice in the dark. The ping came back, a dot on the map, 2 miles south, a graveyard's edge. I held my breath, guiding deputies, praying, but the call came, unresponsive, too late. My screen blurred, my chest tight, her face in my mind. A ghost I'd failed, a call I'd lost. This wasn't just a job, not just a shift. It was a life, a loss, a weight that stayed, haunting my nights, my dreams. The town was quiet, but I wasn't. Every call now a shadow of M, every ring a chance to fail again or to save. I'm a relatively new dispatcher. I've been working for about 1.5 years in a small town. I work 4 10-hour shifts, and 3 of those I am alone for the entire shift working police and fire. In the last 1.5 years, I've never lost anyone. For some reason, my welfare check calls all been false alarms, and my medical call EMRs were always able to get them stable enough to wait for an ambulance. Those calls were few and far between for a start, but all turned out okay. And I was still very green in that respect. The dispatch center was small. Its screens, my world. The radio, my voice to the night. I had someone call from out of state in near hysterics because a woman in our town was sending cryptic statements to her via text about ending her life. But no one knew exactly where she was. M had made statements about not being far from home and something about a cemetery and that she was going to use a rope. The family member said M had made an attempt about a month prior, but law enforcement arrived and saved her life. My heart raced, my hands steady on the keyboard, the call a puzzle I had to solve. I called the last person M had seen, and then called every person M was known to associate with for a vehicle description, clothing description, mood, anything that could help me. I also started a ping on her cell phone and had officers checking all local cemeteries and requesting help from the sheriff's office when the ping was located just outside our jurisdiction. Eventually, the sheriff's deputies found M unresponsive in a cemetery a 2-mile south walk from the ping, but it was too late. It was the first person I'd ever lost, and I beat myself black and blue, replaying all the calls in my head. Everything anyone had ever said, everything I did I do everything right? Was I fast enough? What if I were faster? Did I miss something that could have helped find her in time? We had a picture of her in our system, and I dreamed about her for at least a week. Her face was there in every quiet moment. A weight I couldn't shake, a failure I couldn't unsee. M's face haunted me. Her texts a loop in my mind, a call I couldn't answer. The dispatch center, my safe place, was now a battlefield. Every ring a reminder of her, of what I'd lost, of what I had to save. Tonight, I get a call from a suicide hotline advising of a male with a sharp object walking through town with the intent to end it all. That night with M came rushing back, and I started to get almost nervous, but also was determined that this one would be different. I pinged the phone and got officers moving. Looked up his file to see where his past incidents had occurred for maybe a clue of residence. I even got a tracking dog to try and locate as I'm on the phone requesting my third ping update. An officer called out with him and he's okay. He's emotionally upset but physically okay, and I felt the air go out of me. Once they cleared, I had an officer come in and watch the comm so I could step outside, and I felt like a weight had been lifted off me. I saved this one. I felt like crying, and I don't know if that's normal. The night air was cold, my breath visible, my relief a fragile thing. M's face still there, but quieter now. Maybe I'll actually sleep tonight without seeing M's face? I know it sounds like a pointless story, but no one really understands what my career is or what goes on with it. I just needed to share it with you all. The job was lonely, its weight invisible to others, but the calls were real, lives hanging on my voice, my speed, my choice. I told a colleague, my words halting, the story spilling out in fragments. She nodded, her eyes kind, but she didn't know, couldn't know, the toll of those seconds, those pings, those faces. I started logging every call, every detail, checking fields, replaying moments, looking for what I missed with him. There were stories, dispatchers burned out, haunted by losses, by voices they couldn't save. Each was a mirror, reflecting my guilt, my drive to be faster, better. I kept M's file open, her photo a reminder, a promise to never lose another, though I knew I couldn't keep it. One night, I found a note in my desk, my handwriting, a list of M's contacts, scribbled in panic. I kept it, a weight in my drawer, a piece of that call. The phones still ring, the screens still glow. But I'm different now, marked by M, by the man I saved, by the calls that never end. Story number 3, The Strangers at Hollow Pump. The highway stretched into the night, a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by shadows that clung to the pines. I was young, barely driving upstate to my aunt's for Christmas, my eyes heavy from a 12-hour shift. The road, its name lost to memory, cut through rural nowhere, miles from Akron, with no towns, no lights, just trees and silence. My dashboard glowed red, low fuel. My brother swore he'd filled the tank, but here I was, cursing his name, stranded in the dark with family expecting me by morning. A flicker of metal caught my eye, a hand-painted sign nailed to a pole. Gas, next exit. It wasn't an official road sign. Literally a pole with a slab of metal attached with gas off next exit painted on it. It looked wrong. like something you'd see for a roadside fruit stand, not a gas station. But desperation outweighs doubt. I took the exit, turning onto a narrow country road that twisted through dense woods. The air grew colder, the trees closer, their branches scraping the sky like claws. My headlights barely dented the blackness, and a chill settled in my gut. The road ended at a ruin, a gas station so decayed it seemed to grow from the earth. I came to the gas station and quickly realized it hadn't been open for years. The pumps were gone, rusted sockets in their place. The convenience store's roof sagged, windows shattered, vines choking the walls. I pulled over, my engine idling, and checked the gauge. I probably would only make it another half-mile before running out. No signal to call for help, just me and this relic in the middle of nowhere. I dialed AA on a whim, miraculously getting through. They said they'd sent a truck over. The night pressed against my windows, thick and alive, watching. I left my engine on because when the headlights were off, everything was pitch black. The dark was absolute, the kind that makes you feel small, exposed. I locked the doors, my phone's glow my only comfort, scrolling to distract from the creeping paranoia. Every rustle in the woods was a threat. Leatherface, a bear, something worse. I laughed it off, but my hand stayed on the gear shift, ready to bolt. The forest was too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. Then a shadow moved, sharp and deliberate, at the edge of my headlights. I froze, my pulse spiking. I sensed movement around the side of the old store where my lights were pointed at. Nothing clear, just a flicker of motion, gone when I blinked. I stared into the dark, willing my eyes to adjust. Then, a voice cut through the night, rough and commanding. "Hey, buddy, come over here." My head snapped up. A man stood by the store, lit by my beams, his face gaunt, clothes tattered. He looked like a run-of-the-mill homeless guy. My stomach lurched. Was he squatting here, alone? I didn't move. Still watching him, I rolled up my windows and yelled something like, "Yeah, what's up?" My voice cracked, betraying my fear. "You got any change?" he asked, his tone flat, his eyes locked on me. He had this kind of vacant expression and was standing stiff. I shook my head. "No, man, I don't." My foot hovered over the gas pedal, every instinct screaming to leave. The man didn't blink, didn't shift, just stared, his silhouette unnaturally still against the crumbling wall. The woods behind him seemed to thicken, the darkness coiling like smoke. Then I saw them. There were heads, about 20 or so heads, peeking around trees beyond the man I'm talking to. Not faces, not bodies, just heads, barely visible, their outlines sharp against the trees. My breath caught. I can't see them clearly, but they're definitely people. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, their presence heavy, deliberate. My headlights caught another figure, stepping from the store's shadow, slower, taller, his shape wrong, too angular, too thin. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I turned around to speed off. The engine roared, tires spitting gravel as I tore down the road. My tank was near empty, but I pushed it, the gas station shrinking in my rear view. The trees closed in, the road narrowing. But I didn't stop until the engine sputtered. Maybe a mile out, I pulled over, hands trembling, and updated takeaway with my new location. The driver came back over and filled me up. He was a burly guy, silent, his face unreadable as he worked. I didn't tell him about the station, the man, the heads. What could I say? He drove off, and I sat there, the night pressing in again. I couldn't shake it. Those faces, that voice, they weren't right. I called the sheriff's department in the nearest town, my voice unsteady as I described the station. They said that they'd send a state trooper over at the location I gave. I drove on, the road blurring, my mind replaying the scene. At my aunt's, hours later, the sheriff called back. They said whoever was there was gone, but they could tell a large number of people had been living there for a while. Blankets, canned food, the usual. No arrests, no trace, just signs of life that vanished into the woods. The memory clung to me, sharp and out long after Christmas. I drove that highway again the next year, but I filled up in Akron, avoiding the back roads. The station stayed in my mind, a dark stain I couldn't scrub out. I looked up the area later, digging through forums and local papers. Nothing official, but whispers, hikers seeing lights in the woods, drivers spotting figures on that stretch, gone when they looked again. One post on an old X-thread mentioned a commune in the forest, people who shunned society, living off the grid. No proof, just stories. I started noticing things after that night. My rear-view mirror would catch shadows on empty roads, too quick to be real. I'd wake to the sound of gravel crunching outside my apartment, but no one was there. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe something followed me out of those woods. I just consider myself lucky. I got out, got my gas, got my story. But I wonder about those heads, those silent watchers. Were they lost, like me, or something else? Something that chose that station, that road, for reasons I'll never know. The forest keeps its secrets, and I'm not going back to ask. But every Christmas, when I drive upstate, I check my tank twice, keep my doors locked, and stay on the main roads. The strangers at Hollow Pump are still out there, I think, waiting in the dark, their eyes fixed on the next set of headlights that dares to stop. Story number 4, The Echo of Joe. My father carried Joe's absence like a stone in his chest. Joe was his anchor, the friend who stood by him through life's storms, the best man at his wedding, the one who knew him better than anyone. When Joe took his own life, it broke something in my dad, a fracture that never fully healed. We'd moved far from their shared hometown, chasing a new life in Utah's quiet sprawl, leaving Joe behind in Washington. The distance had stretched their bond thin, but nothing prepared my father for the call that came, the one that changed everything. The news came hard and fast, a punch to the gut. Joe was gone, and his widow's voice trembled through the phone, heavy with guilt. She blamed herself, her words drowned in sobs, as if she could have stopped him. My father listened, his heart heavy, trying to piece together the why of it all. Joe and his wife were fire and flame, passionate, volatile, but bound by a love my dad swore was unshakable. He couldn't believe she was the cause, refused to let her carry that weight alone. He spent an hour on the phone, his voice steady but strained, offering comfort where there was none. He told her Joe would have wanted her to know it wasn't her fault, that his love for her was the truest thing he'd left behind. She hung up, still crying, and my father was left in the silence of his office, the weight of loss pressing down. He needed something to ground him, something to remind him life went on. So he climbed the stairs to check on us, his kids, hoping for a moment of light in the dark. When I was around 6 years old, my dad's best friend ended his life. His name was Joe. Obviously, it was a very rough, emotional time for my dad. Joe was my dad's best man at his wedding, the one guy who was always there for him. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. After my dad got married, he and my mom left Joe and the town they were in to start a life outside the town they grew up in. We'd settled in Utah, far from the memories of their youth. After years of moving around California, my family eventually moved to Utah, where my father worked for a successful internet business. Joe stayed behind in Washington because my family was so far away from their old life with Joe. My father carried that distance like a guilt, wondering if he could have seen the signs. Joe's sister apparently had been blaming Joe's wife for her brother's suicide. Joe and his wife drank a lot of booze and probably, as a result, fought a lot. But my dad saw their love, not their fights. My father had always said they were a shunted couple. Yes, they would fight often, but he hardly knew two other individuals who were so completely in love. He walked through the house, his steps heavy, checking on us kids as we napped. My brother slept soundly. My sister curled up like an angel. I was last, my room a small haven at the end of the hall. He peeked in, expecting to see me dreaming, but something stopped him. A soft sound, a whimper, like a heart breaking quietly. He stepped closer, his own heart racing, and found me sitting on the edge of my bed, tears streaming down my face. I was 5, too young to carry such sorrow, yet there it was, raw and real. A few days after Joe ended his life, his widow called up my father, sobbing, saying about how she thought it was all her fault. My father's words to her echoed in his mind as he knelt beside me. After about an hour's worth of crying and trying to console her, he told her, "If there was a way for me to talk to Joe right now, I guarantee that he would tell you that he loved you and that it wasn't your fault that he ended his life." I looked up, the eyes wet, and called him by his name, Rick. As he walks by my room, he notices a whimper. He turns around and enters the room where he finds me weeping. I wasn't crying like a child, loud and dramatic. It was soft, steady, like I was grieving something I couldn't name. My father's voice was gentle, asking what was wrong. I stopped, just for a moment, and looked at him. "Rick," I said, my voice clear despite the tears. "It's not her fault. I love her. It's not her fault." The words were his, the ones he'd spoken to Joe's widow, but they came from me, a 5-year-old who shouldn't have known. I rolled over, curled up, and fell back asleep, leaving my father frozen, his heart pounding with a truth he couldn't explain. I was 5 years old, so the way I was crying seemed odd to him. Normally, a 5-year-old would cry drastically or overdramatically, but I wasn't. I was just sitting on the side of the bed weeping. My dad enters the room and says, "Maddie, what's up? Why are you crying?" It's then that I stop crying for a moment, look at him with teary eyes, and say, "Rick, it's not her fault. I love her. It's not her fault." With that, I stopped crying, rolled over back into bed, and fell swiftly back to sleep. He stood there, staring at my sleeping form, the coffee forgotten. The words I'd spoken weren't mine. They were Joe's, a message from beyond that shook him to his core. He never told my mother, knowing she'd dismiss it as a child's imagination. But he carried it, a secret that bound us to Joe in a way that defied reason. Years later, he'd tell me the story, his voice low, as if speaking it too loudly might break the fragile thread connecting us to that moment. I don't remember saying those words, but I feel them, a whisper of Joe's love that lingers in our home. Story number 5, The Silent Watcher. The room grows still, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. I was tucking my 3-year-old son into bed the other day. We say the typical slew of "I love you," and then he stops talking, which is extremely atypical. His small face, usually full of chatter, turns serious. His eyes, he has maybe shut up once in his entire life. A shiver runs down my spine as I sense something beyond the familiar shadows. The night feels different, charged with a presence I can't name. His head tilts toward the pillow, his gaze shifting. He puts his head down on the pillow, kind of pointing his face down, and rolls up to look at me. A tiny finger rises, pointing to the rocking chair in the corner. His arms were down by his side, and he just points one little finger towards the rocking chair in the room. The chair creaks softly, though no wind stirs the curtains. My breath catches, a mother's instinct screaming that something is wrong. His voice breaks the silence, small but firm. Without moving, he says, "Mommy, before you leave, can you take the rocking chair out of the room so the man will leave me alone?" The words hit like a cold wave, draining the warmth from my face. I'm pretty sure all the color drained from my face. My eyes follow his finger, searching the chair for what he sees. A chill settles. The room suddenly too small, too crowded. He speaks again, his tone matter of fact. He then proceeds to tell me that the man's name is Johnny, and he's a bad man and very mean. The name lingers, a shadow given form by a child's words. Johnny doesn't say anything, though, because he doesn't have a mouth, and just sits there and stares at my son. I stare at the chair, expecting movement, a shape, anything. The silence grows louder, a void where answers should be. But the weight of his words presses down, unyielding. Johnny doesn't have a mouth and just sits there and stares at my son. My heart races, torn between comforting him and fleeing the room. The rocking chair remains still, but the air hums with an unseen gaze. I pull him close, whispering assurances, yet the unease clings, a mystery born in his innocent eyes. The night stretches on, and I sit by his bed. I move the rocking chair to the hall, its absence a small victory against the unknown. My son sleeps, But his words echo, Johnny, the silent watcher. I check the room, the corners, the shadows, finding nothing but the weight of his fear. Days pass, and he mentions Johnny less, but the chair's old spot feels empty, watched. Key, I research, asking neighbors about the house, but they shrug, unaware of any history. Weeks later, the unease returns. My son points to the hall where the chair now sits, whispering, Johnny's back. I see nothing, but the air shifts, colder, heavier. I move the chair again, this time to the garage, locking the door. He sleeps better, but I lie awake, listening for the creak of wood, the shuffle of an unseen presence. The house feels alive. Its silence a mask for something older, something patient. As years go by, my son grows, the memory fading into a child's tale. But I keep the garage locked, the chair untouched. I consult a local historian who mentions old stories of a mute figure tied to the land, a guardian or a lost soul. The idea lingers unanswered. My son, now older, laughs it off, but I catch him glancing at empty corners, a flicker of that old fear. The silent watcher remains a whisper in our home's bones. Story number 6, The Farewell Dream. The house was quiet, but a dream broke the silence with a whisper from beyond. I had never suffered a death in the family. Papa, my grandpa, was fading, but no one spoke of it. His face appeared in my sleep, mouthing words I couldn't hear. The air grew heavy, carrying a truth we all avoided. That morning, I woke shaken, the dream too vivid to dismiss. One day, I remember having a really strange dream. It wasn't my world, it was his, filled with cowboys, his old love. It was cowboys and Indians. I've never been interested in westerns and all of that, but my pop-up loved them. He stood before me, silent, his goodbye a shadow. I knew something was wrong, and it wasn't just a dream. My sister was awake too, her presence a quiet alarm. My sister was already up, which was equally strange. We moved through the morning, the house holding its breath. Dad came home, his routine unchanged, but his eyes betrayed him. He carried news we weren't ready to hear, a truth tied to my dream. He spoke, and the world stopped, his words a blade. Before my dad turns the car off, he says, "Guys, I have some news for you. Pop-up died this morning." I was stunned. The dream flashing tech, his silent farewell clear. I recalled the dream and realized that it was my papa. He was mouthing goodbye. The moment he left us matched the hour of my waking. Lucky, our dog knew before we did. His howl a final cry. The day Pop-up died. Lucky skulked out from under the bed, and as he took his last breath, Lucky took off on the far side of the room. The house felt empty, but Pop-up's presence lingered. His goodbye was real, etched in my dreams, a farewell I'd never forget. Pop-up's illness was a shadow we didn't name. In 2001, my grandpa, who I always referred to as Pop-up, was diagnosed with prostate cancer. My family downplayed it, shielding me from fear. I don't know the details, but I remember thinking it wasn't too bad because My whole family played the whole thing down constantly. I'd never seen death, never known its weight. I'd never even seen a dying person before, so I had no way to judge how Pop-Up was actually doing. So I accepted my dad's insistence that his father was doing just fine. I trusted Dad's words, believing Pop-Up would recover. When doctors sent him home, hope seemed real. Eventually, the doctors told my family to take Pop-Up home. My parents insisted it was progress. My parents assured me it was because he was getting better. Dad was there daily, helping, then fetching us. Obviously, my dad would be at my grandma's and Pay-Pup's house every morning to help out. He'd return, asking if we wanted to visit. But after he had done everything he could for them, he would return home and ask if my sister and I wanted to go see them. We always agreed, piling into the car. We would obviously say yes, and he'd hop back into the car and carry us back out to their house. The dream came unbidden, a vision out of place. Suddenly, he appeared in my dream. Well, not in my dream, more like in front of it, and he mouthed something inaudible, and I woke up. I woke early, unsettled, the clock glaring. I looked at the clock. It was around 7:30, way too early for a 13-year-old boy to be up. I dragged myself out, the house oddly awake. I said good morning and grabbed some cereal. My sister's presence felt wrong, her silence mirroring mine. Dad's routine held, but his face was heavy. And around noon, my dad came home as usual and asked us if we wanted to see Grandma and Pop-Up. He didn't need to ask, but he did. A habit unbroken. By this point, he knows he doesn't need to ask, but habits are hard to break. We drove, the car quiet, tension building. We load up the car and head on over. His words came before we stopped, shattering the illusion. I was stunned for many reasons. I'd believed he was healing, but the dream knew better. Obviously, first, I thought he was getting better. And two was because the dream's timing was no coincidence. It was his farewell. I later realized he had died at 7:30 that morning, the same time he appeared in my dream. Lucky our Jack Russell sensed it too. Furthermore, my dad would always bring our dog with him to my grandparents' house, a little Jack Russell named Lucky. He stayed close, hiding under Pop-Up's bed. Lucky would always hide under the hospital bed my Pop-Up was in. At the end, he fled, his howl a mournful echo, and let out a chilling howl. Pop-Up's presence lingered, his dream a final gift, haunting me still. Story number 7, Trapped in Heaven's Gate. The abandoned ward wasn't just empty, it was waiting. In Adelaide, a city of a million, urban exploration was a thrill for Lucas and his friends, chasing the rush of forgotten places. Its shadows hid secrets, eager to ensnare. My friends and I, for the past year, have been pretty heavily involved in draining and urban exploring water drains, abandoned buildings, etc. But due to our city's small population, there are a pretty limited amount of locations to find. A new site, Heaven's Gate, sparked their excitement. An abandoned retirement and brain injury ward left to rot. The name felt like a taunt, a gate to nowhere. So, my friends and I were pretty ecstatic to find a new location being passed around by the herbexing community known simply as Heaven's Gate. Sit. The building beckoned, its doors unlocked for ruin. Now, usually when a building is abandoned here, it gets pretty tightly locked up. But whenever an abandoned building gets scheduled to be demolished, they unlock everything for workers and construction site managers, I presume. Hidden behind overgrown vines and an iron fence, it stood near a main road, its proximity to homes a false comfort. Anyway, my friends and I traveled to this location, which is pretty well hidden behind a lot of vegetation and a large iron fence, but still located next to a main road with houses adjacent to the complex. They scaled the fence, hearts racing with the thrill of trespass. We jump the fence and go about our exploration, taking photos and just messing around like teenagers do. The ward was a relic, scarred by time. The majority of the building had been trashed, and we found a few sleeping bags and hundreds of empty spray cans. I'm guessing the majority of the residents were Italian and Greek, as there were a lot of Greek and Italian books and posters and visas littered in the rooms. Books and tapes whispered of lives left behind. My friends and I explore the complex without any problem and leave within an hour of being there. Lucas's photos failed, blurred by haste, urging a return. The problem is my friend moved it too fast through the place. So a lot of my pictures I took on my Nikon were either too blurry or too dark. And I really wanted to get a few good shots before it got demolished. Alone, the ward's darkness swallowed him. So the same night I went back, taking photos throughout the building. The silence was a weight, pressing against his courage. I followed the main hallway as you go through the back side of the building intended for nurses. You can get lost easily. His torch and camera flash were his only allies. So, the building is a pretty dark place, but I brought a pretty powerful hand torch and my Nikon has a flash, so I can see pretty well. The mental ward loomed, its doors a trap. I make my way through the hallway and pass through a set of hospital doors. These doors were being held open by chairs that you just had to climb over. The trap snapped shut, sealing Lucas inside. Now, this section of the ward was the brain injury or mental ward for patients with disabilities. A noise shattered the quiet, loud and wrong. As I make my approach through the metal ward, taking photos, I suddenly hear a loud noise, almost like shelves or a book falling. The chairs moved. The doors closed, locking him in. I stick my head out the room, the one I was currently in. I think it was like a TV or recreational area, and looked down the hallway to see that one of the chairs had been pushed out the way and the door closed. Panic surged, his escape cut off. To this day, I have no clue how or what would have moved the chairs, as it was filled with sand to prevent patients from throwing them or using them as weapons. The doors held firm, mocking his efforts. It takes at least 2 to 3 people to lift them. Anyway, the doors are shut, and I run over to see if I can open them, and I try and push, and nothing works. Lucas pounded the button, but the power was dead. So, I start spamming the button like crazy. But obviously the power's off, so that doesn't work either. The black bar above the door was a silent jailer. I'm not sure how the door actually works, but it had a massive black bar across the top, which I assumed was like a powerful magnet or something that can be turned on or off, and the default is just on. No one knew he was there, his phone useless. At this point, I'm kind of freaking out because I'm not only trapped, my phone was flat, and I swore those doors were open when I came to visit with my friends. Desperation drove him to search for freedom. I try to press forward to see if I can find another exit. I finally find the second exit, but the double doors are closed as well with the exact same system. The ward was a maze, its exit sealed. I was kind of pooing myself at this point because no one knew I was there and I couldn't get out. Lucas scoured for windows, finding only walls. I tried walking along the walls to see if I could find a window I could smash through, but there was nothing. Frustration boiled, tiles shattering under his rage. I started getting really frustrated. So I started throwing these pieces of tiles on the ground at the door harder and harder. Footsteps answered, followed by a chilling laugh. Then I hear the noise of footsteps and a freeze. Lucas called out, hoping for rescue. I convinced myself to call out, so I did. Yo, help, I'm trapped. An old woman's laughter echoed, then fled. As soon as the footsteps stop, I hear the laughter of an old woman or a heavy smoker from the other side of the doors. The laughter turned into running away, and the sound disappeared as they became more distant. Its speed defied reason, unnatural and swift. This at first made me think it was a tagger or kids, but the loft of an old woman didn't make any sense. No one sounding that old could run that fast. Darkness consumed him as his torch died. Eventually, my torch went out, and I was in absolute pitch darkness. Lucas hid in a bathroom, locking the door out of memory. I managed to find a bathroom with a door which is just closed and locked. Shapes danced in the void, feeding his fear. Now, I don't know if you get this, but if you're staring at the dark too long, you start to see shapes and even figures. The ward's silence was a predator, waiting. Now, imagine being alone in an abandoned mental ward, trapped and without light. Dawn brought a fragile hope. I ended up staying the night until sunrise. Lucas roamed, desperate for escape. Obviously, I did not just sleep, but I walked out into the hallways to have another crack at opening the doors. A painted window offered salvation, its light a faint promise. I walked around, and to my luck, I found an old window that I'd missed before. It had been spray painted black, and only small dots of light shined through. He shattered it, fleeing the ward's grip. So, I picked up an object and threw it at the window and ran as far away as possible. He kept his ordeal secret, fearing judgment. I've been back there a few times, but I never told my friends about me going alone, as I feel like they'd have gotten pissed that I went back without them. Lucas avoided solo explorations, the ward's laughter haunting his dreams. He researched Heaven's Gate, finding tales of vandals and lost patients, but no old women. Was she a ghost, a squatter, or something else? He joined an urban exploration forum, sharing his story. Others reported eerie sounds, locked doors, moving and abandoned sites. The ward wasn't just empty, It was a trap. A package arrived, no sender, with a spray can inside, etched with a faint laugh-like symbol. Lucas destroyed it, but the ward's echo lingered, a warning of its watchful presence. Story number 8, The Man at the Window. You're curled up in bed, watching a movie, when a tap at the window breaks the night's calm. Who's out there on a snowy street? A friend or a stranger with eyes fixed on your room? The glass shakes with a heavy thud, and a figure moves in the dark, too close to your home. This isn't just a late-night visitor. It's a threat, pacing outside, watching through your blinds. You escape his gaze, but the handprint remains. Is he gone or waiting for another night? Living in the heart of a bustling English street, my girlfriend and I shared a ground floor flat with my mom, tucked behind a locked wooden gate in a converted bakery. In the winter of 20, my girlfriend and I were living in the center of a popular and busy street in England in a ground floor flat. The street we lived on was just off a very busy road that had about 1,000 pubs on it. So it was normally quite populated most hours of the day. The flat we lived on was about 7 in an old converted bakery. There was a very large locked wooden gate with a buzzer, and the flats were all in a courtyard behind the gate. We shared the flat with my mom. Our bedroom window faced the street, inches from passers-by. Our bedroom windows faced directly onto the street where people would walk past on the pavement, always exposed. My girlfriend and I were laying on my bed watching a film on my laptop. The room was small, cozy but cramped, with the bed pressed against the window. My bedroom, like most UK bedrooms, was a tiny shoebox-sized room with a bed and a wardrobe and about 5 feet of extra floor space. Comfy. My window was right next to my bed and faced out onto the street. A soft tap at the window didn't faze us. Friends often stopped by. As we were laying on my bed, someone knocked on the window. That wasn't unusual. I had quite a few friends that lived and worked near my flat, so we didn't think much of it. Just a neighbor, right? We continued watching our film and settled down. Then a heavy thud shook the glass like fists pounding, and about half hour to 45 minutes later, there was a massive bang on my window that sounded like someone slammed their fists against it and ran off. That wasn't a friend. We were a bit startled and decided to go take a look outside, as it was evidently not one of my friends at this point. He was out there. We stepped into the snow courtyard, opening the gate, but the street was empty, unnaturally quiet. We went into the courtyard and opened the main gate and couldn't see anyone on the street at all. It was freezing and snowing, but still unusually quiet. We lingered, scanning the dark. We stood there for about 5 minutes, just looking around. I spotted a small man across the street in a trench coat and heavy boots, his face unclear without moccasins. I noticed a small man on the other side of the street, mid-length trench coat, heavy boots. But as my eyesight is awful and I never wear my glasses, I didn't actually see discerning features. Something felt wrong. It was on the opposite side of the street, and I was walking along the street from the main road, from left to right up towards our flat. I just got a bit of a strange vibe from him. Pointed him out to my girlfriend. We watched him, but he didn't glance our way. We both just stood and watched for a few minutes, and as he passed, he didn't turn to look at us or anything. Then he crossed to our side, approaching fast. After less than a minute, I looked to my right and saw that this same guy had now crossed over to our side of the street and was walking towards us. Panic hit, and we ducked behind the gate, peering through the gap. My girlfriend and I watched for a minute and then proceeded to panic and shut ourselves behind the gate. Instead of going back into our flat, we crouched down out of sight so we could watch through the gap under the gate to see if he passed by. His boots crunched snow, just stopping dead outside our gate. The thing I remember the most vividly is the sound of his boots creaking on the snow and watching him come to a dead stop directly outside the gate. He knew we were there. My girlfriend and I were both now suitably crapping ourselves and were quietly hurried back inside. He wouldn't leave. Inside, lights off, I saw his silhouette pacing outside my bedroom window. Our flat had an open-plan kitchen and living room with a door that led to the straight hallway. My bedroom was right off at the end of the hallway, and my mom was off to the right. All the lights were off, and I poked my head into the hall, and I had a clear line of sight into my bedroom from there. When I looked, I could see the silhouette of this man pacing up and down slowly outside my bedroom window. My mom slept through it until I woke her. My mom had slept soundlessly through all of it, but I decided to go in and wake her up to let her know what was going on. She dismissed it until she saw him pacing between our windows, peering through the blinds. She brushed it off until I told her to look outside, and she saw this man now pacing back and forth outside her window and mine, knowing that at the right angle you could see through my blinds from outside. He was watching us. I pressed myself up against the wall and scooted my way down the hallway back to the living room, then rang the police. My girlfriend and I weren't really sure what to make of the situation, but it felt pretty ominous. Police arrived quickly, finding him nearby, claiming he was homeless but oddly well-dressed. The police arrived not 10 minutes later, met me outside, and said they found him. He claimed to be homeless, looking for a place to stay, but he was very well dressed and clean-shaven and had no other possessions with him. They suggested he was curious about us, but it felt darker. The police officer offered forth the fact that it's more likely he was intrigued by the fact that there were two obviously queer young females in bed together, and he was having a little snoop. But who knows? What did he want? The next day, a sticky handprint marked my window, chilling proof of his presence. The next day, I was outside having a cigarette with my girlfriend, and I noticed a very prominent sticky handprint on my window. You know, as if someone had their hand pressed up against it. He'd been that close. My girlfriend swears she saw him at the train station a few months later. So, trench coat man, let's never meet again, you absolute creep. The handprint haunted me, a reminder of how exposed we were. Was he still out there? My girlfriend's sighting at the station gnawed at us. His face burned into her memory. Why us? The busy street, once comforting, felt like a stage, our lives visible through thin blinds. Who else had watched? We installed heavier curtains, checked the gate's lock obsessively, but sleep came hard. Had he targeted us before? Neighbors mentioned odd figures lingering at night, but no one acted. Was he part of something bigger? The police's dismissal left us wary, trusting only ourselves to stay safe. Some shadows lingered too long. Story number 9. The Voice on the Line. I was volunteering in a listening service that was only aimed at helping children of up to 18 years old. The phone was my bridge, a lifeline for kids in need. I was their voice, their anchor, but one call would unravel me. Its words a web of lies. A lot of training was required for this role, even though it was an anonymous phone call service. The training was a shield, preparing me for pain, but not for deception. I sat in the quiet office, the phone silent, unaware of the voice waiting to haunt me. The night was calm, but calm can hide a storm. Its whisper is deadly. I was ready to help, but not ready for her. The voice that wasn't what it seemed. The calls were my world. If a child presented us with a dangerous situation and we had their permission, we could call the appropriate authorities, like police or social services. Each call was a weight, a story I carried home. The kids were real, their fears raw, their trust fragile. I listened, my heart open, my voice steady, but each shift tested me. The office was a sanctuary, its phones a portal to their lives. I was their guide, but the path was dark, its end unseen. The night shift was quiet, but quiet was a lie, hiding a call that would break me. The kids broke my heart. After a few weeks, I was feeling settled in and had taken many calls. The rhythm was familiar, the voices a chorus of need. The majority were just kids joking around, but there were many tough calls too. The jokes were light, but the real calls were heavy, their pain a burden. I heard their tears, their fears, their secrets, each one a scar. My own child's face lingered, their innocence a mirror to those I helped. The calls were a tide, pulling me under, their weight relentless. The office was my stage, but the drama was theirs, and I was its witness. The drive home was a battle. Most evenings after I'd finished my shift, I would feel so overcome with emotion that I would fight back tears on my way home in my car. The road was a blur, my tears a release. Each call stayed with me, their voices echoing in the dark. Having a small child of my own often made it harder to forget about. My child was my anchor, their smile a reminder of why I listened. The night was a weight, the calls a chain, binding me to their pain. I drove, the stars above, the office behind, but the voices followed, relentless. The call came late. One phone call in particular really startled me, and to this day I often think about it. The call was a shock, a moment frozen in time. The office was still, the clock ticking, the night heavy with silence. I sat, my headset on, my heart steady, ready for the next voice. The phone rang, a signal in the dark, its sound a summons. I answered, my voice calm, but the night was about to change. The call was trapped, its voice a lie, waiting to unravel me. The voice was small. It was about 15 minutes before my shift ended, and I was sitting around. The clock was slow, the office quiet, my mind drifting. I hadn't taken a call in over an hour, and time seemed to be moving so slowly. The silence was a weight, the phone a sleeping beast. My phone rings, and a petite, soft female voice says, "Hello." The voice was fragile, a child's plea. I introduced myself, giving a fake name as I always do, and tell her a little bit about the service and what we would do if someone is in danger. My words were practiced, my tone warm. She says almost immediately, "I need help. I'm babysitting my younger sister. She's only 2 months old and I'm 9. She's diabetic. She's turning blue. My mother and father have gone out. Please help." Her words were a jolt, a cry that pierced my heart. The voice was desperate, its urgency real. My heart leapt, my training a distant memory. I felt as though all my training had gone out the window. So panic was a tide threatening to drown me. I was panicking, but tried my best to keep my thoughts clear and my voice clear. My voice was a lifeline, my calm a lie. I acted fast. Go outside and get help. Go knock at the neighbor's house and call the nearest adult you see. My instructions were sharp, my fear hidden. The girl's voice trembled, her steps a faint echo through the phone. The little girl talked me through her steps and said she had the baby in her arms and was about to go out at the street. Her words were a guide, her courage a light. The phone crackled, the sound of traffic a distant hum. Listening to the noise of the traffic and the sounds of the night air. The night was alive, its sounds a chorus of fear. My heart was beating so fast, aching to know what was going on and feeling so helpless. My pulse was a drum, my helplessness a weight. I gripped the phone, my breath shallow, the office closing in. The girl was out there, alone, her sister in her arms, and I was powerless. Help arrived, or so I thought. I could hear the little girl speaking to someone, but couldn't make out what was being said. Her voice was faint, the conversation a blur. Next of all, a lady came on the phone. The new voice was a relief, a beacon. "I have them." "Hello? Hello, I have them both. I'm going to take them to the nearest hospital." Her words were a promise, her tone steady. I thanked the lady, and she told me that help was on the way. Gratitude was a wave washing over me. I ended the call and gathered myself. The call was over, but my heart still raced. I informed my supervisor. My voice trembled, the story spilling out. She was as shocked as I was when I gave her the details. Her shock was a mirror, her face pale. The office was quiet, but the call lingered, its weight heavy. I sat, my hands shaking, the night a scar. The truth was a lie. She called the hospital in the area that the girl had given me, and also the police. The calls were urgent, our hope fragile, and after an hour of filling in the mandatory documents, my supervisor followed up the inquiry about the call we had received, and they said they had no such cases. The words were a shock, a crack in our trust. The hospital was empty. The girl's story a void. The night ended, the office closed, but the call stayed with me. I drove home, the stars cold, the truth a puzzle. The girl was a ghost, her voice a fiction, but I didn't know it yet. The revelation came later. It wasn't until next shift the following week, which I was grateful for as I needed the time off, when I returned to work. The week was a blur, the call a shadow. My supervisor called me into her office and informed me that she had gone through my notes on the call I received and had gone to search the system for the similar scenarios and keywords. Her office was a refuge, but her words were a blow. She told me that every caller has a profile, and the girl who had called was a frequent caller, and that she wasn't a little girl, but a lady in her early 30s in a psychiatric hospital, and she likes to pose as different people, but mostly as a child. The truth was a knife, cutting through my trust. The voice wasn't a child's, it was a woman's. Her deception calculated. The hospital was her home, her calls a game. I sat, stunned, the office sinning, her voice echoing in my mind. The girl was a lie, her story a trap. The betrayal stung. This creeped me out, considering the nature of service and the fact that an adult was abusing it. The betrayal was a wound, raw and deep. The service was for children, its purpose pure, but she'd tainted it. This information angered me and also disturbed me. Anger was a fire burning through my shock. I felt silly and naive as I believed this girl's story. My naivety was a scar, my trust a casualty. The call was a performance, her voice a mask. I'd been played, my heart open, my training useless. The office was no longer a sanctuary, it was a stage, and I was its fool. She called again. Over the next few months, she called a few more times under different descriptions and always posing as a vulnerable person. Her voices changed, but her game was the same. Each call was a lie. Her stories a web, weaving fear and need. I listened, my heart heavy, my trust frayed. The phone was a trap, her voice a weapon. I knew her now, but the knowledge didn't ease the chill. The calls were a shadow, following me through my shifts. The office was a battlefield, each ring a challenge. Answered, my voice steady, but my heart was not. I left, but she stayed. I wasn't there for much longer, but that story always gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. The memory is a weight, its edges sharp. I left the service, the phone behind, but her voice lingered. The girl who wasn't a girl, the crisis that wasn't real, she haunted me. The hospital held her, but her calls reached me. There lies a scar. I drive now, the night quiet, but her voice echoes, a ghost in my mind. The service was for help, but she turned it into a game. Don't trust the voice. Don't believe the call. Story number 10, The Stranger at the Pump. The road to Canada was empty, but something was watching us. My wife, Diana, and I were driving north, fresh from our wedding. The car filled with laughter and music. Me and my wife, Dana. The dashboard glowed, casting shadows as we talked about Cancun, our honeymoon waiting across the border. Diana's head nodded against the window, her breathing soft, exhausted from the day. Diana slowly started to fall asleep. The city lights had faded, replaced by endless woods, the road a lonely ribbon under the stars. I fought to stay awake, my eyes heavy. What kind of place feels so alive in its silence? The gas station was a ghost town. I pulled into a dimly lit station, the only car in the lot, neon signs flickering above empty pumps. I pulled over at a gas station. Diana stirred, but didn't wake. I leaned over, whispering, "I'm taking the keys and locking her inside." Her hand flicked lazily, a half-conscious acknowledgement. I stepped out, the air cold and sharp, the station's windows dark except for a clerk inside. My phone, I realized too late, lay forgotten on the driver's seat. Why did the quiet feel like it was waiting for something? Diana wasn't alone. I was gone 6 minutes, grabbing a Red Bull, when I returned to chaos. I came back to find my wife shaking and crying. Diana was curled in the passenger seat, tears streaming, her voice choked. She couldn't speak at first, her hands trembling as she gripped the armrest. I climbed in, heart racing, scanning the lot, empty, silent. After she calmed down, she relayed the following. Her story spilled out in fragments, each word heavier than the last. What could terrify her in a locked car? The woman came from nowhere. Diana had drifted back to sleep when a tapping on the driver's window jolted her. A tapping on the driver's side window. She reached for the unlock button, too tired to think, but froze. Didn't he say he had the keys? A woman's voice mumbled outside, low and rhythmic. "Are you tired?" She kept repeating, "Are you tired?" Diana turned, and there she was, long black hair, wide eyes glinting in the dark, a crooked smile twisting her face. Who stands at a stranger's car and asks that? The stranger wouldn't leave. Diana screamed for her to go, but the woman laughed, her voice sharp, saying she was tired too. Her eyes never left Diana, unblinking as she tugged at the door handle. The woman never took her eyes off her and tried the door handle. Diana fumbled for my phone, but it was useless without me. She slammed the horn, the sound piercing the night, hoping to scare the woman or alert me. My wife started honking the horn. The woman only smiled wider, mumbling about someone named Sarah. Was she toying with her or calling to someone else? I held Diana, guilt gnawing at me for leaving my phone, for not hearing the horn. I don't know how I didn't hear the honking. The station clerk, when I asked, saw nothing, no woman, no other cars. Diana's description chilled me. The woman wasn't disheveled or lost. She didn't look homeless nor dirty. Her clothes were neat, her hair sleek, her presence too deliberate. She seemed perfectly normal and well kept. Yet those eyes, they weren't human. Diana said, "What kind of person appears in the middle of nowhere and vanishes?" We drove on, Diana clutching my hand, the road to Canada stretching endlessly. We headed out. I kept the radio off, every shadow outside the car a threat. Diana wouldn't close her eyes, her gaze darting to the mirrors. I'll never be so grateful that I have a habit of locking doors. If she'd opened that door, if I hadn't locked it, I pushed the thought away. The woman's words, "Are you tired?" looped in my mind. her mention of Sarah a puzzle with no pieces. Was she after Diana or something else entirely? At the airport, we tried to shake it off. Boarding our flight to Cancun, we had our bags packed for Cancun. The sun and beaches helped, but Diana tensed at every knock, every stranger's glance. Back home, I dug into local stories, searching for answers. A forum mentioned a woman matching Diana's description, seen at rest stops near the border, always at night, asking odd questions. Some called her a ghost, others a drifter with darker motives. One post claimed she'd been spotted with a man, both vanishing after approaching cars. Was Sarah her partner or her next target? The house felt different after that. I live in Washington. We double-checked locks, installed cameras, kept the dogs closer. Diana avoided driving alone at night, her sleep broken by nightmares of wide eyes and that crooked smile. She'll never forget the woman's wide eyes and the gaze. I blamed myself for the phone for stopping at that station. The what-ifs haunted us. If Diana had unlocked the door, if the woman had gotten in, it chills me to think what would have happened if my wife never realized I had the keys. What did she want? And why us? Months later, the fear lingers. To this day, I'm thankful I have a good habit of locking doors. I've read about carjacking rings, human traffickers using women as bait, but this felt different, too personal, too strange. The station's footage, when I called, was unavailable. No police report led anywhere. Diana swears the woman's voice wasn't just tired, it was hungry, like she was savoring the moment. I'd recommend locking doors no matter how long you're gone. The road to Canada is behind us, but that night isn't. Some encounters leave marks you can't see. Story number 11, The Phantom on the Rooftop. The attic stairs creaked under my feet, each step pulling me deeper into darkness. When I was around teen, I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. The top-floor apartment was our hideout, a place to escape the world, but the roof was where we felt alive. That night, we planned to sneak up there, but I paused, needing a quick detour. So, I told him, I'll meet you up there. The building, ancient and crumbling, seemed to watch me as I climbed. The attic was a maze of shadows, lit only by my phone's faint glow. There were no lights up there, so we used our phones to guide us. The air was thick with dust and forgotten relics. Broken chairs, warped boxes loomed like silent sentinels. I moved toward the roof door, my footsteps echoing too loudly. Something shifted in the dark, a flicker of movement that wasn't mine. My pulse quickened, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination. Then the shadow moved. As I made my way to the roof door, I saw a shadow pass by me. It was tall, too tall, its edges blurred like smoke. I laughed nervously, assuming it was my friend, Isle, messing with me. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. I followed the shape, my voice bouncing off the walls, but the shadow darted past again, silent and swift. It wasn't Kyle. It couldn't be. The air turned cold, and my phone's light flickered. The shadow crossed my path once more, closer this time, its presence heavy, like a weight on my chest. I froze, my bravado gone. Then I heard it, Kyle's voice, faint but clear, from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. My blood ran cold. If Kyle was downstairs, what was up here with me? I stumbled back, my phone shaking in my hand. I ran, the attic closing in like a trap. The roof door was only steps away, but it felt miles off. The shadow lingered in my peripheral vision, never fully seen but always there. I burst onto the roof, gasping, and slammed the door shut. Kyle found me minutes later, confused by my panic. I have no idea what that shadow figure was, but it wasn't human. I never went back to that roof at night. Days later, I couldn't shake the encounter. Kyle, skeptical but curious, suggested we check the attic again in daylight. The space looked mundane under the sun, but I noticed something we'd missed. A faded photograph tucked behind a beam, showing a man in old-fashioned clothes, his eyes hollow, staring directly at the camera. Kyle laughed it off, but I felt that same heavy presence from that night. What if the shadow wasn't just a trick of the dark? I dug into the building's past. It had been a boarding house in the 1920s, home to a recluse who died in the attic under mysterious circumstances. Tenants reported strange sightings for years, footsteps, whispers, a tall figure in the dark. The landlord, Kyle's dad, dismissed it as old wives' tales, but he admitted the attic was never rented out because tenants wouldn't stay. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow waiting at the top of the stairs. Years later, the building was sold, and the new owners gutted the attic. They found a hidden compartment in the floor filled with personal items, a journal, a locket, and a knife, all stained with something dark. The journal's final entry, dated decades ago, read, "It follows me now. I can't leave. I still feel it sometimes, that weight, that presence, like it's not done with me. I still refuse to go back up to that roof at night." Whatever lived in that attic wasn't just a shadow. It was something older, something that never left. Story number 12, The Hand in the Scrapyard. The air in the countryside was sharp, laced with the scent of rust and forgotten things. I stood in the yard of my cousin's rural home, the horizon swallowed by fields of brittle grass and skeletal trees. I once had a friend that I knew for almost 5 years. He was gone now, taken by a car crash far across the ocean, but his absence lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. The barn loomed in the distance, its red paint peeling, and beside it, a pile of scrap, twisted metal, rotting rugs, and a broken tree called to me like a warning. I didn't know why, but my stomach churned, as if the ground itself was whispering for me to turn back. The dream came back to me in fragments, hazy but insistent. I'd seen this place before, not in life, but in sleep. A junk pile, a split tree, laughter cut short by danger. I didn't remember much of it, but standing here, the memory clawed its way to the surface, sharp and unsettling. My cousin, Emily, tugged at my sleeve, her grin wide and oblivious. "Come on, let's explore," she said, already scrambling toward the pill. I followed. my sneakers crunching on gravel, but each step felt heavier, like wading through water. I always thought of it as just being a stupid, weird dream I had. The pile was a graveyard of discarded things, rusted pipes, shattered glass, a mattress sagging under years of rain. We climbed, our laughter echoing in the quiet yard. But the higher we went, the more the air seemed to thicken. We were jumping around on a pile of junk, and just as we were having a good time, I perched on a branch of the broken tree, its bark rough against my palms, while Emily sprawled on a rolled-up rug across the pile. My legs swung, restless, and I bounced, the branch creaking under my weight. That's when I felt it, a prickle at the back of my neck, like eyes watching from the shadows of the barn. I glanced over, but nothing was there, just the wind rattling the silo's loose panels. The branch snapped with a crack like a gunshot. I plummeted, my arms flailing, and landed hard on my back across a rusted gutter. I snapped, and the tree fell. The world spun, my breath gone, pain radiating from my spine. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. The gutter tilted, and I started to slide, my eyes locking onto a jagged metal spike jutting from the pile below, a rusted rod, sharp enough to pierce through me. I tried to grab onto whatever I could, which was a small twig which snapped easily and sent me falling. My heart stopped, time slowing as I rolled toward certain death. But then a hand, strong and sure, gripped my arm, yanking me back to balance on the gutter. I gasped, my chest heaving, and scrambled to sit up, safe on the gutter's edge. As I was slowly rolling off the gutter, below the gutter was a thin metal, sharp, jutted metal, sticking up. I turned to thank Emily, my voice shaky. But she was still across the pile, her foot tangled in a screen, her face pale with shock. Her foot fell through a screen, and she couldn't get to me in time. She hadn't moved, hadn't reached me. My blood ran cold. The hand that saved me wasn't hers, it wasn't anyone's. I stared at the empty air where I'd felt the grip, my skin still tingling from the touch. Something had pulled me back, something I couldn't see. The yard was silent now, the wind gone still, the peat looming like a monument to my near death. Emily climbed down, her voice trembling as she asked if I was okay. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment, the hand, the strength, the impossible rescue. I immediately told my aunt about this. That night, I sat in the guest room, the house creaking around me, and thought of him, my friend, the one who'd been in like a father when mine was away. He was protective, yes, but in a fatherly way. He died. But had he ever really left? I'd felt him before, in quiet moments, in the way the world seemed to nudge me away from harm. Was it him reaching across the veil to save me? I started noticing things after that. The barn door would swing open on windless nights, its hinges groaning like a voice trying to speak. Footprints, faint, too large to be mine or Emily's, appeared in the dust near the scrap pile, only to vanish by morning. I found an old photo in the attic, tucked inside a book. A man standing by the barn, his face blurred but familiar, his stance protective. The house felt different, not haunted, but guarded, as if someone was keeping watch. My mother agreed with me that it could have been anything, but we're both convinced that it could have been my father figure. I began leaving small offerings by the pile, a stone, a feather, hoping he'd know I was grateful. Months later, I returned to the city, but the scrapyard stayed with me. I dreamed of it again, not the fall, but the hand, warm and steady, pulling me to safety. I started researching guardian spirits, ancestral protectors, the thin line between life and what comes after. The stories varied, but they all pointed to one truth. Sometimes those we love never truly leave. I'm still contemplating on what it really could have been. I don't know if it was him or something else wearing his kindness, but I feel it still, watching, waiting, ready to catch me if I fall again. The world feels bigger now, and I'm not sure I'll ever stop looking for that hand in the shadows. Story number 13, The Carved Name in the Crawl Space. The house I was born in and grew up in was built in 1905, and at least one person had died there. The walls seemed to hold secrets, whispering through the creaks of old wood every time a storm rolled in. As a kid, I'd lie awake, convinced something was watching me from the shadows of my closet. There was a crawl space that went from the back of my closet, where there was a hole about 3 feet, maybe 4, just enough to literally crawl through. The darkness beyond that hole felt alive, like it could swallow me whole if I got too close. I never dared to explore it, not then. By my teenage years, the fear hadn't faded, but curiosity started to creep in. We never went in there, partially because there was no need, and mostly because I was a kid and it scared the crap out of me. But one summer, my dad decided to redo the attic insulation, and everything changed. The only entrance to the attic at the time was a tiny square panel in the ceiling of one of the upstairs rooms. I'd always hated that panel. It had a way of shifting slightly, leaving a sliver of black void exposed like an eye peering down. We thought Dad was pranking us, but he swore he never touched it. The attic job forced me to face my fears. The attic always scared the hell out of me because sometime when we were kids, we would wake up and the panel would be slightly shifted and pushed in. Climbing up there, I felt the air grow heavy, like I was trespassing. The attic was unfinished, so we're laying on boards on the crossbeams, since you could hypothetically fall through the attic if you stepped poorly. Every step was a gamble, the boards groaning under my weight. I carried a cheap flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the dust-choked air. Then I saw it. The attic stretched further than I'd imagined, a labyrinth of shadows leading somewhere I didn't want to go in. I pushed forward, heart pounding, and found a drop-off. I noticed that the attic goes back way further than I thought. The space plunged down, connecting to something below. I keep going, and it drops down to this large area I would later realize is the roof of our porch. It was like a hidden room, a pocket of the house no one talked about. There was a creepy wooden children's chair standing up in this room. It sat there, perfectly upright, as if waiting for someone who'd never come. The floor was uneven, the air thick with the smell of mold and something sharper, almost metallic. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then I saw the board. There was also a board piece of wood about a half inch thick in the room the area of a rectangular sheet of paper. There were names carved into the board, one in each corner, top, bottom, left, right, the one in the middle, and two randomly in between. My blood ran cold as I read them. The weird part is that the one in the middle was carved deeper than any of the others, then gone over in some kind of red ink. The weirdest part is that it was my name. My name, spelled exactly as I write it, stared back at me, the red ink glowing faintly in the flashlight's beam. My knees buckled. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. I couldn't process it. My name has a semi-unique spelling, but I wouldn't say it's extremely uncommon. But seeing it there, carved deeper, marked in red, felt like the house was claiming me. I stumbled back, the chair looming in my peripheral vision like a silent witness. I didn't really think about it at the time. All I knew was I had to get out. I scrambled through the attic, the crawl space's entrance leering at me as I passed. We redid the roof of the porch shortly after and pulled the chair and boards out. The workers tossed them into a dumpster without a second thought. But I couldn't shake the image of my name etched like a warning. Life went on, but the house felt different. I just dropped it and got the hell out of there. Every creak, every shadow seemed to carry a new weight. I started noticing things, my closet door ajar when I swore I'd closed it, faint scratches on the floor near the crawl space panel. One night I woke to a sound like fingernails tapping on wood coming from inside the walls. My brother, still living in the house years later, laughed off my questions about the board. I asked my brother, as he still lives in the house, and he says that we tossed it with the rest of the stuff we found there years ago. But his voice faltered, like he knew more than he was letting on. I couldn't let it go. I dug into the house's history, piecing together fragments from old records and neighbors' stories. At least one person had died there. A man, a recluse, had lived in the house decades ago, hoarding strange artifacts in hidden corners. Some said he'd been obsessed with the crawl space, spending hours inside, muttering about keeping the names safe. No one knew what he meant, but the stories lined up too well with what I'd found. The chair, the board, my name. It wasn't random. I started to wonder if the house had chosen me, or if something inside it had. Years later, I moved out, but the house never left me. I'd dream of that hidden room, the chair waiting, the board glowing with my name. Sometimes I'd wake up swearing I heard that tapping again, even in my new apartment. I tried to find the board, hoping I'd stashed it somewhere, but it was gone. Last time I shared this story, people said a picture would have been great. I wish I'd taken one, but back then I was too scared to even hold the flashlight steady. The house still stands. My brother still lives there, and he says it's quiet now. But I don't believe him, not when I know what's hiding in the walls. Every house has its secrets, but mine had my name. I've met a couple of people who spelled my name the way they spelled it, but still it was very weird. I'll never know who carved it or why, but I feel it, even now, a pull, like the house is still watching, waiting for me to crawl back in, and sometimes in the dead of night. I wonder if my name is still there, carved somewhere in the dark, calling me home. Story number 14, The Cyclist's Shadow. The evening was warm, the kind that wraps you in a false sense of safety. I was halfway through my walk, the city's hum fading behind me, when I heard it, a faint creak of wheels on asphalt. My heart skipped. I turned, and there he was, a man on a bike. His eyes are locked on me, a smile too wide for comfort. He was close, too close. I quickened my pace, but the creak followed, steady, deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. See, the street stretched ahead, empty, except for the long shadows of dusk. I was alone. My phone clutched tightly, texting my boyfriend every step. I hear something behind me, a sound that didn't belong, a rhythmic squeak, unnatural in the quiet. I glanced back, and he was there again, the same man, now riding slower, his gaze unyielding. He smiles and says, "Hi." I forced a smile, said nothing, and kept moving, my pulse racing as the sky darkened. My earbud was in, but the music was off, every sense tuned to the world around me. I had one headphone in, but turned my music off the moment I felt his presence linger. He sped past, vanishing down a side road, and for a moment I exhaled, but relief was fleeting. I heard a noise behind me, that same creak, and my stomach dropped. He was back, riding beside me now, his bike swaying as if to match my steps. This wasn't chance. He was hunting. I tried to lose him with a trick I'd used before, speaking French, pretending I didn't understand. I decided to just say a few words in French to throw him off, to make him think I was someone he couldn't read. It worked before, with pushy strangers in crowded places, but not this time. After realizing I apparently didn't understand, he rode off, only to return minutes later, his voice sharper, probing. "So, do you understand me?" he asked, leaning closer. I kept up the act, but my heart was pounding, my fingers trembling as I texted for help. The sun was gone now, the streetlights flickering to life, casting his shadow long and jagged across the sidewalk. This disgusting excuse of a person starts to tell me things, vile, explicit things, his words dripping with malice as he rode beside me. I froze, my legs moving on autopilot, my mind screaming. I'm kind of frozen, just walking there, texting my boyfriend, begging him to call. When the phone rang, I answered, forcing my voice to stay steady, but inside, I was unraveling, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. I'm not built for this, barely over 5 feet, small enough to feel like a target. I am a 19-year-old female measuring approximately 5'4", and live in a quiet corner of Ontario, Canada, where the streets are supposed to be safe. That evening, I just wanted a burger, maybe some fries, a small rebellion against the delivery apps I usually relied on. I usually use Uber Eats or a food delivery service because I can't drive, but the walk to downtown, 25 minutes away, seemed harmless in the summer light. I live about a 25-minute to 30-minute walk away from our downtown area where the fast food joints cluster. Their neon signs a beacon of normalcy. I had told my boyfriend, who's always worried about me, that I'd be fine. My boyfriend, who lives half-hour away from me and is quite overprotective of me, tried to talk me out of it, but I laughed off his concerns. I assured him it was light out and I would be messaging him the whole way. I was wrong to dismiss him. The walk started innocently enough. I'm about 20 minutes into my walk through an open area, a field sprawling to one side, a usually busy road on the other. But that evening, the road was quiet, the hum of traffic replaced by an unsettling stillness. The long stretch of sidewalk I'm walking on curved past a block of apartments across the street, their windows dark, their looping road a perfect path for someone to circle back unnoticed. I didn't think much of it until that first encounter. I turned to see a guy kinda sketchy looking trailing behind me on a bike riding on the road, his posture slouched, his eyes too focused. So I smiled but said nothing and kept walking, hoping he'd lose interest. After that little exchange, he sped off, and I thought that was the end. I was wrong. I've been texting my boyfriend this whole time, keeping him updated. His joke's a lifeline to keep my nerves at bay. I tell him about this strange little exchange, and he tried to lighten the mood, knowing how easily I'm spooked. I'm easily put on edge by people I don't know, especially males, a reflex from too many bad encounters in the past. I've had a number of bad experiences, moments that taught me to trust my instincts, to watch for the smallest signs of danger. But this was different. This is all purposeful. The man's return wasn't random, but this time he starts riding slowly besides me as I walk, his bike wobbling as he matched my pace, his presence a weight I couldn't shake. The guy says hello again and asks why I'm out so late. The sun was setting, the sky bruising purple, and his question felt like a trap. My guard is immediately up. I'm alone, small, and the darkness was closing in. I'm small, walking alone, and it's getting dark, and every fiber of my being screamed to get away. I leaned on my old trick. I can speak both English and French pretty well thanks to years of French immersion, and I thought it would work again. But this man was persistent. I figured he looped around the apartment again when he reappeared, his bike creaking louder now, his voice more insistent. I turned to look at him to let him know I knew he was there, hoping my defiance would scare him off. It didn't. This is where my plan backfired. My French confused him at first, but it only made him bolder. I just kept speaking a few words in French here and there, my voice shaking, praying he'd give up. Instead, he laughed, a low, ugly sound, and started his tirade. I start to just stare straight ahead and move away from the road some more, trying to put distance between us. But he stayed close, his words a poison seeping into the air. Texting my boyfriend everything that's going on. I felt like I was screaming into a void, my fear growing with every second. As soon as my phone rings, I pick it up and force calm into my voice. But my boyfriend's panic mirrored my own. I try and sound as normal and calm as possible while my world crumbled. After being on the phone a little while, I stop and turn around. It was a gamble, a desperate move to break his rhythm. I was holding in many tears until I was sure he was gone. He didn't turn around to follow me more. He rode off, his silhouette swallowed by the dusk, and I stood there, trembling, my phone pressed to my ear. I turned around and walked the other way. My legs heavy, my breath ragged. I waited. I was sure I was out of his sights before I ran. Sobbing on the phone to my boyfriend who was too far to help, I'm feeling helpless as the reality sank in, how close I'd come to something worse. The walk back was a blur, my mind replaying every moment, every word he'd said. Eventually, I calmed down, but the fear lingered, a scar I couldn't shake. After an hour or so of calming me down, my boyfriend offered to drive over, but I told him not to. I told my boyfriend not to, but that I appreciated the offer. He ordered food for me, a small gesture to ease the pain. He felt awful and ordered me the food to make me feel safer, even from miles away. But safety felt like a lie now. I hope you fall off your bike, I thought, a fleeting wish for justice that wouldn't come. One thing I simply must try and get you to understand is just how creepy it is to be so vulnerable in that moment, with no one to turn to, no place to hide. Darkness enveloping you, the world shrinking to just you and a stranger who sees you as prey. It is incredibly uncomfortable, a violation that lingers long after the threat is gone. I don't know who he was, but I know what he wanted: to instill fear, to take something I hadn't given. I stopped walking to downtown after that. The memory of his voice, a warning I couldn't ignore. Every creak of a bike, every shadow on the road brings it back. I'm stronger now, but I'll never forget how small I felt, how the world turned against me in the fading light. Story number 15, The Drunk Father's Threat. What happens when a routine call turns into a nightmare? I spent nearly a decade working with a large law enforcement agency in my home state as a police dispatcher. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room, your headset buzzing with the weight of someone's worst night. Instead of answering calls made to 911, my job was to remain in direct contact with and consistently provide information to officers and other first responders. Every word you say could mean the difference between calm and chaos. But what if the person on the other end doesn't want help? They want to destroy you. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind that makes your skin prickle. During a specific graveyard shift with very few cars in its entirety, I dispatch officers to an escalating yet non-physical domestic dispute. The call came from a small house on a street lined with sagging porches and flickering streetlights. In short, it concerned child custody, which can undoubtedly shorten tempers and set parents on edge. A mother's voice trembled through the line, her words sharp with fear and anger. A father had violated the hours of his visitation rights by showing up intoxicated at his now ex-wife's house. His truck sat crooked on the curb, engine still warm, reeking of gasoline and bad decisions. She wanted him gone, but he wouldn't budge. She, of course, was not too pleased, prompting the emergency call when he refused to leave. The mother stood in her doorway, clutching her phone, her kids asleep upstairs, unaware of the storm brewing below. Normally, the response time for emergency incidents is based upon a priority system depending on the circumstance and whether or not a person is in imminent danger. But the board was clear. the night empty of crises. However, since it was a slow night with no incidents holding, I dispatched 2 available officers immediately. Their sirens cut through the silence, a fleeting warning to the neighborhood that trouble had arrived. Officers pulled up, their flashlights slicing through the dark. They arrived within minutes, separated both parties involved, and de-escalated the situation. The father, swaying on his feet, reeked of whiskey, his eyes glassy but defiant. As previously mentioned, the father was legally intoxicated, according to an administered breathalyzer, and had driven his truck to his ex-wife's house. His slurred words spilled out, a mix of excuses and accusations, but he wasn't behind the wheel when they arrived. But since he had legally parked on a public street and wasn't behind the wheel when officers arrived, he wasn't charged with drunk driving. The law was clear, but the detention wasn't. I punched his name into the system, my fingers steady despite the hour. I ran his information and background, and except for a prior DUI, driving under the influence, and a couple of minor offenses, his record was otherwise clean, and he didn't have any warrants out for his arrest. His history wasn't spotless, but it didn't scream danger, not yet. The primary officer writing the report that happened to respond was the patrol shift supervisor, my sergeant, a very nice man who earnestly tried to help every citizen he could, including cutting them some slack if an arrest was avoidable. Sergeant Davis, with his calm drawl and weathered badge, saw a man who needed a chance, not cuffs. He led the man off with a trespass warning and even gave him the opportunity to call someone to drive him home or use public transport and return for his truck the next morning after he'd sobered up. It was a kindness most wouldn't offer. But kindness wasn't what he wanted. This wasn't good enough. The father's face twisted, his gratitude curdling into rage. The man opted for an Uber driver, and the officers left after one had arrived. The Uber's taillights faded, and the street fell silent again. Apparently, the father had told the Uber driver to drop him off just around the next corner and proceeded to call 911 again, demanding to speak to an officer. His voice crackled through my headset, thick with venom, demanding answers the law couldn't give. My sergeant was made aware of this and asked me if I would call the man back to see what else he wanted. I dialed, my pulse steady, expecting a rant, but not a reckoning. Since it was extremely common for dispatchers to make callbacks, I had no problem with this request. The line connected, and the father's voice exploded, a torrent of rage that filled the room. The father proceeded to berate me at the top of his lungs. His words weren't just angry, they were vicious, each syllable a blade. He called me, amongst other things, a worthless piece of trash. I sat back, my headset tight against my ears, as he unleashed a storm of insults. And he said he called me to help, but that I was siding with the woman and to send the officers back. His accusation stung, but I'd heard worse. "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir," I said, my voice level. "I can send officers back to you. What's your location?" He proceeded to call me every name in the book, including several racial and homophobic slurs, and asked me, "What's your location?" "Never mind. I know where your building is, and I'm heading over there to mess you up." The air in the dispatch room grew heavy, the screens flickering as his words sank in, amongst other insults. He informed me that he had utility chains and gasoline in his work truck and threatened to not only blow up our communication center, but drag my burning body around the parking lot behind his truck. His threat wasn't just personal, it was apocalyptic, a promise of fire and ruin. Sir, I understand you're upset, but I advise you not to make these kind of threats. Everything you say is currently being recorded. He replied saying, "You think I give a hoot? Send your officer back out here and I'll string them up. Go ahead." His defiance was a challenge, daring me to act. I happily and maliciously complied. My fingers flew across the keyboard, logging every word, my voice calm as I relayed the situation to Sergeant Davis. I informed my sergeant over the phone of the father's allegations. The line crackled with his response. "We're on our way." Sirens wailed again, closer this time, converging on the street where it all began. He, as well as 5 other squad cars, responded. The night, once quiet, now hummed with the weight of consequence. They found the man waiting by his pickup truck, back out in front of his ex-wife's house. He stood there, defiant, his truck a hulking shadow behind him. I'll admit, this guy had a pair on him. But bravery and stupidity often wear the same face. He was promptly arrested for the following: violation of a trespass order for reappearing at the house, misusing of an emergency line, harassment of public safety employees, i.e. for threatening a 911 call taker, terroristic threats for threatening to blow up our building, and resisting arrest once he was placed in cuffs. Cuffs clicked, and his threats dissolved into the night. The mother watched from her window, her silhouette a silent witness. The kids slept on, their world untouched by the chaos their father had sown. Sergeant Davis called me later, his voice heavy with the night's toll. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, though he couldn't see, my hands still trembling from the call. The dispatch room felt smaller, the screens colder, as if the father's voice lingered in the static. Days later, I learned he'd been charged and held, his truck impounded, his threats a permanent mark on his record. But it wasn't the arrest that stayed with me. It was the rage, raw and unfiltered, a reminder of how thin the line is between order and anarchy. Every night after, I checked the logs, half expecting his name to reappear. The house on that street stood quiet, its windows dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the father's anger had left something behind, a shadow that clung to the pavement. Other dispatchers shared stories of their own, calls that crossed the line, voices that promised harm. But this one was mine, a scar, earned in the dark. In summary, tread carefully, deadbeat dad. I'm armed with a phone, a radio, and a criminal database, and a patrol sergeant, and I'm not afraid to use them. And in a world where words can ignite, I'll always be ready to answer the call. Story number 6, the shambled man at the empty pump. You're driving down a road so dark it feels like the world forgot it exists. No lights, no cars, just you and the hum of the engine. Then, out of nowhere, a single flickering bulb appears in the distance. Do you stop? What if stopping means meeting something that doesn't belong in this world, something that moves wrong, looks wrong, and knows you're there? Would you risk it for a moment's rest or keep driving, praying it doesn't follow? The night has a way of hiding things that don't come out until you're alone, vulnerable, and too far from help. That's when they find you, when the silence turns into a warning. We thought we were safe, just another stop on a exhausting trip. But that gas station wasn't empty. Something was waiting, and it had been waiting for us. Have you ever seen fear in someone's eyes and realized it's not just about what's in front of you, but what's behind you, chasing you, refusing to let go? My husband and I were on a road trip coming back to Louisiana from Iowa. We were driving 4-hour shifts while the other person slept in the back of the car. The highway stretched endless, a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the night. We'd been at it for days, trading the wheel to keep moving to get home. My husband had picked a back road, a shortcut he swore would shave hours off the trip. It was a mistake. The road was desolate. No houses, no streetlights, just fields of nothing under a starless sky. The car's headlights barely cut through the dark, and every mile felt heavier, like we were driving into a void. We hadn't seen another soul for hours when we spotted it, a gas station, small and run down, sitting alone like it had been eaten by the world. Finally, we come across a small local gas station with a single light on. It was closed and our car was the only one there. The pump was rusted, the windows boarded, and that single bulb flickered like it was on its last breath. I rubbed my eyes, ready to take the wheel, and reached for the door handle. We pull over, and I'm getting ready to open the door so we can switch places, and my husband tells me to hold on. His voice was sharp, urgent. I froze, following his gaze to the back of the station. It came from the shadows, stepping into the weak light like it had been waiting for us all along. I look up, and from behind the back of the gas station, a man wearing rags shambles towards us quickly, not quite running, which made it even scarier in a zombie-esque way. His clothes hung off him in tatters, flapping like dead skin, and his movements were wrong, jerky, uneven, but fast. His head tilted at an odd angle, and though I couldn't see his face, I felt his attention lock onto us. My heart slammed against my ribs. I told my husband to hurry and drive away, but he didn't move. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the figure like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Every second he waited, that thing got closer, its shambling steps eating up the distance between us. I grabbed his arm, my voice rising to a scream, "Go now!" He was intrigued, though. He just stared ahead at the guy as he got closer and closer. And I started freaking out and screaming for him to go until he did. Finally, he snapped out of it, slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward. The tires screeched, kicking up gravel as we peeled away. I twisted in my seat, staring out the back window. As he drove away, I looked behind us at the gas station as it disappeared into the distance. As far as I could see, the man followed the car at the same odd pace he was walking at until he could no longer be seen. He didn't run, didn't slow, just kept coming, his silhouette shrinking, but never stopping. The road swallowed us again, the gas station fading into the dark. But the fear didn't leave. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see him behind us, somehow keeping pace. My husband was quiet, his knuckles white on the wheel. "What was that?" I whispered. He didn't answer, just shook his head. We didn't stop again until dawn, when the world felt real again. But even then I couldn't shake the image of that figure, its unnatural gait, the way it seemed to know we'd be there. What do you do when you realize you've stumbled into something you weren't meant to see? Later, I looked up that road, that station. Old forums mentioned a drifter who'd vanished years ago, last seen near that stretch of highway. Locals said he didn't die. Not really. They said something took him, changed him, and now he wanders, drawn to anyone who stops too long. I don't know if it's true, but I know what I saw. That wasn't a man. It was something else, something that wanted us to stay. Story number done. The Suitcase Stranger. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin walls of the mobile home like a warning. I stood in the narrow hallway, the dim light flickering above, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. Many years ago, when I first met my ex and her family, they lived in a mobile home. It was a cramped, creaky place, the kind that felt alive with secrets. My ex, Sarah, had a younger sister, Lily, who was troubled, always in and out of psych wards, her mind a maze of half-truths. My ex and her younger sister shared a room in this mobile home, and Lily's stories about the man in the hallway were dismissed as madness. But madness doesn't explain everything. The air in that house was heavy, like it clung to your skin. My ex has this younger sister who is a bit messed up, and she'd wake in the night, whispering to someone who wasn't there. She told me this story about how her younger sister would wake up and talk to the man in the hallway. The man always had a suitcase and wore a brimmed hat. Sarah laughed it off, saying Lily saw things that weren't real. I nodded, but the way the hallway shadows stretched at night made me wonder. Then I saw him. Not clearly, not at first, just a silhouette at the edge of my vision. A man's outline with a hat, standing where the light didn't reach. The suitcase in his hand gleamed, its leather cracked but polished, as if it held something alive. I blinked, and he was gone, but the air turned cold, sharp with the scent of old ink and dust. I told myself it was exhaustion, the stress of dating in that chaotic house. But the mobile home didn't feel like a home. It felt like a trap. The walls seemed to listen, absorbing every word we spoke. Sarah's parents were kind but worn, their faces etched with years of worry over Lily. The mobile home was their temporary refuge, a place to rebuild before moving on. Fast forward a few years, my ex and I had a son together. We named him Noah, a bright-eyed boy who brought light to our lives. Her parents moved out of the mobile home and into a house, and we were renting the mobile home. Noah's room was the same one Sarah and Lily had shared, its walls still marked with faint crayon scribbles. One night, the house turned against us. Noah was asleep, his small form curled around his favorite stuffed animal, a yellow duck he called Ducky. One night after our son had gone to bed, he was asleep for a while, and we heard him get out of bed. I waited for his little footsteps, expecting him to toddle out for a glass of water. Instead, he started talking to someone and said, "Hi," and started talking about his favorite stuffed animal, which at the time was Ducky. His voice was bright, unafraid, chatting as if with an old friend. My blood ran cold. I called out, my voice sharper than I meant. I called back and asked who he was talking to. Noah's head poked out from his room, his eyes wide and innocent. He pops his head out of the room and informs me he's talking to the man with a suitcase and who's wearing a hat. My heart stopped. At the time, he was about 2.5 and had never heard about his aunt seeing the exact same guy. Noah hadn't heard Lily's stories. How could he? Yet his words echoed hers, precise and chilling. The man wasn't just a story anymore. That night, I sat by Noah's bed, watching him sleep, the duck clutched in his arms. The hallway outside his door felt like a void, swallowing sound and light. I started noticing things, scratches on the floor near Noah's room, too deep for a child's toy. The suitcase's image haunted me, its contents unknown but heavy, like a debt waiting to be paid. Sarah brushed it off, saying kids imagine things, but her eyes betrayed her fear. The mobile home's walls seemed to pulse, and at night I'd hear a faint tap, 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 like fingers drumming on leather. We stayed longer than we should have, trapped by circumstance. One evening, the suitcase appeared, not in a dream, not in a shadow, but in the hallway, sitting alone under the flickering light. Its clasp gleamed, unlatched, and a faint hum came from within like a heartbeat. I didn't dare touch it. Noah woke, pointing at it, saying, "He's here." I grabbed him and left, driving to a motel with Sarah. We never went back. The mobile home was razed a year later, but I still see that suitcase in my dreams, waiting. Story number 18, The Shadow of Friar. The air in the old house always felt heavy, like it carried secrets no one dared to whisper. In the quiet of a rural town, where fields stretched endless and the nearest neighbor was a mile away, our family lived in a creaky, weather-worn home. My younger brother, Eli, was barely 4, his eyes wide with the kind of wonder only a child possesses. But there was something unsettling about him, something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. He had a younger brother who had an imaginary friend in his youth. Eli called him Friar, a name that rolled off his tongue with eerie familiarity. At first, I thought it was just a phase. Kids make up friends all the time. But Eli's stories about Friar weren't the usual childish tits. He described Friar as a dark-skinned man with little clothes who loved to hunt in the wilderness. The way Eli spoke with such vivid detail made me wonder if he was repeating something he'd heard or something he saw. Every night the house seemed to hum with a life of its own. I'd lie awake, listening to the floorboards groan under invisible weight, the wind rattling the windows like it wanted to come inside. Eli's room was down the hall, and I'd hear him talking, his small voice carrying on full conversations in the dark. I remember I would be in my room and hear him talking like he was having a conversation, and when I would try and check on him, he would immediately become silent and turn his head as soon as I peeked around the corner. It sent chills through me, the way his head snapped toward the door, his eyes glinting in the dim light, as if he knew I was there before I even moved. Very unsettling. I tried asking him about Friar, but he'd clam up, his lips pressed tight like he was guarding a secret too big for his small frame. The strangest part wasn't the talking, it was what Eli said next. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Eli's fork froze mid-air. His eyes locked on something beyond the walls, and he spoke in a voice too steady for a child. Then one day, he told me that Friar used to live nearby in a house a long time ago, and then some white people came and burnt him alive and killed his village. My mother and I exchanged glances, our stomachs twisting. How does a 4-year-old come up with something so specific, so brutal? I tried to laugh it off, but the image stuck with me. A man consumed by flames, his village reduced to ash, his spirit lingering in the land our house now stood on. Not exactly something you expect to hear from a 4-year-old, do it. The house began to feel like it was watching us. I started noticing things. Shadows that moved too slowly, corners of rooms that felt colder than they should. Eli's behavior grew stranger. He'd draw pictures of a man with dark skin, always holding a spear, standing in a forest that looked too much like the woods behind our house. One night, I found him sitting cross-legged in the living room, whispering to the air. When I asked who he was talking to, he smiled and said, "Friar's teaching me how to hunt." The way he said it, so calm, so certain, made my blood run cold. Then came the night that changed everything. Our middle brother, Caleb, had been away for the summer, staying with his dad, while my older brother, the middle child, was visiting his dad for the summer. Eli didn't like Caleb much. He said Caleb was mean, always teasing me or pushing me around. The day before Caleb was due back, Eli pulled me aside, his voice low. But the day before he uttered back, my youngest brother told my mother and I that Friar does not like it when brother is mean to me. He's going to scare him. I brushed it off as kid talk, but that night, as Caleb slept in the bunk bed he shared with Eli, a scream tore through the house. The night he got home, my mom and I were downstairs and heard a scream that I can still remember to this day. We ran upstairs and found the middle brother swearing that something was shaking the bed violently. Caleb was pale, his eyes wide with terror, insisting the bed had been shaking like something was trying to throw him off. But Eli, in the bottom bunk, was fast asleep, his breathing steady, untouched by the chaos. It was a bunk bed. My youngest brother was sound asleep. The days that followed were heavy with unease. Caleb refused to sleep in the bunk bed, opting for a sleeping bag on the floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that Friar wasn't just in Eli's head. The house felt alive, its walls pulsing with a quiet rage. I started researching the land our home was built on, digging through old records at the local library. What I found made my stomach churn. Centuries ago, A small settlement of indigenous hunters had lived here. They were driven out, their homes burned, their people slaughtered by settlers hungry for land. The records didn't name anyone called Friar, but the coincidence was too stark to ignore. Had Eli somehow tapped into a memory the land itself held? Eli's connection to Friar seemed to deepen. He'd wander into the woods behind the house, claiming Friar was showing him secret paths. I followed him once, keeping my distance, and saw him stop in a clearing, staring at something I couldn't see. He tilted his head like he was listening, then nodded and ran back home. That night, I dreamed of a man with dark skin, his eyes burning with sorrow, standing in a field of ash. He didn't speak, but I felt his anger, his grief, like it was my own. Then came the accident. A month later, my youngest brother took a bad fall and cracked his skull. Eli had been climbing a tree in the backyard, chasing one of his hunts with Friar when he slipped. The crack of his head against the ground echoed in my ears for weeks. He was fine, but never spoke to Friar again after that. The hospital light seemed to wash something out of him. He stopped drawing freers, stopped whispering in the dark, but the house didn't feel any lighter. If anything, it felt angrier, like something had been left unresolved. Eli's sleepwalking got worse. He'd appear in my room, standing inches from my bed, his eyes open but empty. He would also sleepwalk constantly and show up right next to me in bed and stare at me until I woke up. I'd wake to find him staring, unblinking, his small frame casting a shadow that felt too large, and promptly crouched myself. I started locking my door, but it didn't help. One night, I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. One night, I heard the front door open and close. My heart pounded as I crept downstairs, peering out into Penopus. There was Eli, barefoot in his underwear, standing at the edge of the woods. I opened the door and found my brother at the far end of the yard in the snow, only in his underwear, staring right at me. Then he slowly waved. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, like he was signaling something or someone. I called his name, but he didn't move. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and for a moment I swore I saw a shadow behind him, tall and lean, watching. The next morning, Eli didn't remember a thing. He was back to being a normal kid, laughing and playing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Friar hadn't left. The woods behind our house felt different now, like they were holding their breath, waiting. I started avoiding them, sticking to the well-lit parts of the house. But at night, when the world was quiet, I'd hear it, a faint rustling like footsteps circling the house. One night, I looked out my window and saw two glowing eyes in the trees, unblinking, locked on me. They weren't Eli's. The years passed, but the memory of Friar lingered. Eli grew up. His sleepwalking faded, but he never spoke of Friar again. I moved away, but the house stayed with me, its secrets etched into my bones. Last year, I went back to visit. The house was empty, the fields overgrown, but the woods were still there, dark and sloughed. I walked to the clearing where Eli used to stop, and for a moment I felt it, a presence, heavy and ancient, watching from the trees. I didn't stay long. Some things are better left undisturbed. Story number 19, The Echo of Screams. A few years ago, my brother would get a call on his cell phone. It wasn't a voice, not a prank, not even silence. It was a sound that clawed at your soul, static, jagged, and relentless, woven with screams that didn't belong to any human throat. He'd wake in a cold sweat, the phone buzzing like a trapped insect, the screen glowing with an unknown number. Every time he answered, the noise burrowed deeper, a cacophony of despair that lingered in his ears long after he hung up. He tried ignoring it, but the calls wouldn't stop. They hunted him night after night, as if the sound itself was alive. The first time he told me, I laughed it off. A glitch, I said, a crossed line. But his eyes were hollow, his hands trembling as he described the screams, not just loud, but wrong, like they came from somewhere beyond. He'd mute the ringer, but the phone vibrated anyway, the screen flashing with numbers that shifted when he tried to read them. He swore the static whispered his name, faint but unmistakable, buried in the shrieks. I didn't believe him until I heard it myself. Late one evening, when he shoved the phone to my ear, my blood turned to ice. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a presence. He tried everything to make it stop. He changed his cell number after about a month of it, and it stopped. For a fleeting moment, he thought he was free. But then, like a predator biding its time, it began again. The exact same noise, no pattern to the calls, no logic, just relentless torment. I watched him unravel, his sleep stolen, his sanity fraying like old rope. He started recording the calls, hoping to find a clue, but the files corrupted every time, leaving only distorted fragments of screams. Once he played a recording, and I swear I heard my own voice in the static, calling out. Desperate, he traced the number. Finally, one day, he decided to backdial the number. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about. The man's voice was frail, confused, insisting he'd never called anyone. My brother hung up, shaken. The next night, the calls returned, louder, angrier. The screams now carried words, fragmented, guttural phrases in a language neither of us knew. He called the number again, and this time it was a woman, young, terrified, saying her phone had been stolen weeks ago. Each call back led to a dead end, but the static grew hungrier, more insistent. By then, my brother was a ghost of himself. He decided to say screw it, end his contract with the phone company, switch to a new one, and then got an entirely new number. He prayed it would end. You guessed it. The screaming static calls continued after a short delay. He stopped leaving the house, convinced the sound was following him, echoing in the hum of streetlights, the buzz of his fridge. I tried to help, researching cursed phone lines, paranormal signals, anything that could explain it. I found stories, old ones, about voices trapped in wires, souls caught in the liminal space of communication. None offered answers, only dread. The calls weren't just noise anymore, they were a force. My brother said he saw things in the static, flickers of faces, eyes that weren't eyes, hands pressing against the screen. One night, he woke to find his phone on, the call active, but he hadn't answered it. The room was freezing, the air thick with the smell of ozone. He smashed the phone. But the next day, a new one arrived at our doorstep, unboxed, his number already active. The delivery man didn't exist when we checked. The calls kept coming, and now they left voicemails, long, garbled messages that sounded like a crowd trapped in agony. His life fell apart. Around this time, he lost his job and his phone. The call was stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected. But the silence didn't last. One day, my mom asked me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the static screaming. It had found a new target. The message played for 3 minutes, and in the final seconds, I heard my brother's voice screaming my name. We played it for him, and he collapsed, sobbing, begging us to make it stop. We showed my brother, and he was freaking out. He called the number back. It said the number was disconnected this time. That should have been the end. Never heard from it again after that. But I wasn't so sure. I started noticing things. Faint static in my earbuds, a hum in the walls at night. One evening, I found an old rotary phone in the attic, one we'd never owned. It rang, and I froze. The air grew heavy, the lights dimmed, and the static screamed through the receiver before I could lift it. I unplugged it, burned it, and scattered the ashes. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, I hear it, a faint, distant scream, not from a phone, but from the air itself. The truth is, I don't think it's gone. My brother moved away, started over, but he doesn't talk about it. My mom keeps the home phone unplugged. I check my phone every night, dreading an unknown number. The static wasn't just sound, it was a doorway. And once it's open, it never fully closes. Story number 20, Shadows of the Silos. No one warned us about the silos, but we should have known better. The rusted giants loomed over Fort Worth, Texas, their crumbling facades whispering secrets no one dared to hear. Ethan and I, adrenaline junkies with a knack for trouble, had scoured forums for the next big urban exploration. The main street silos were it, forgotten relics of a bygone era, fenced off but not forgotten. We thought we were ready for anything. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every step feel heavier. We parked a mile out, our headlights cutting through the dark like a blade. The silos stood silent, their silhouettes jagged against the moonless sky. Something about them felt wrong, like they were watching us back. My reckless self and equally reckless friend had to make the long 40-plus minute drive. Every step toward the silos felt like a dare. The path was a maze of overgrown weeds and rusted railroad tracks, each one a hurdle in the dark. We stumbled over ditches, water soaking our boots, rocks skittering underfoot. A low hum vibrated through the ground, too faint to place, but too real to ignore. The path required us to cross 3 sets of railroad tracks surrounded by another over the growth of wild grass and plants. The air shifted heavier as we neared the first silo. Ethan froze, his flashlight beam darting to the shadows beneath an overpass. A voice, soft, almost lost in the breeze, called out. A voice called out to us from below an overpass. My pulse hammered in my ears. Instantly, we both recoiled back. Was it a trick of the wind or something else? We didn't wait to find out. Ethan grabbed my arm, and we moved faster, our breaths shallow. The silos loomed closer, their rusted walls pitted with holes like bullet wounds. This wasn't just a place, it was a trap, and we were already too deep. We continued crossing the tracks slowly and carefully. The encounter set the tone for the night, a warning we didn't heed. We reached the first silo, its base littered with broken glass and twisted metal. We came to this site that we had long awaited. The structure was a monolith, its surface scarred by time and neglect. Ethan, always the bolder one, scanned for an entry point. I followed, my flashlight catching glints of something metallic embedded in the dirt, old tools, maybe, or something more sinister. We circled the silo, our footsteps muffled by the thick grass. An open window gaped like a wound in the wall. We found an open window in Silo 1 that led to a room within. The air was stale, thick with the scent of rust and decay. A ladder, bolted to the wall, stretched into the darkness above, a rusty ladder attached to the wall. It tempted us, but the risk was too high. We backed out, deciding to explore the other silos first. Silo 2 was a dead end, its entrances sealed with concrete. Silo 3 was no better, its walls slick with moss and graffiti. Frustrated, we looped back toward the first silo, the ladder now our only option. That's when I saw them. Two beams of light slicing through the dark at the far end of the silos. Two flashlights were bobbing up and down at the other end of the silos. My stomach dropped. Ethan's face paled. "Lights out," he hissed. "Lights out, my friend," to me. Bon. We crouched low, our flashlights off, the beams growing closer. Who were they? Cops? Thieves? Something worse? We looked at each other, frantically exchanging guesses as to who these people might be. The lights moved with purpose, closing the distance fast. Ethan's eyes met mine, and we bolted. We sprinted for the railroads, practically hurtling over the ditches. The ditches we'd crossed so carefully now felt like traps, their water splashing under our frantic steps. Hiding between the tracks, we watched the lights pause where we'd stood moments ago. They were hunting us. We lowered ourselves between the ditches to hide from the unknown. Minutes dragged like hours, the silence deafening. When we finally peeked out, the lights were gone. They had gone and weren't there anymore, and their lights were out. It was as if they'd never existed. Emboldened, we flanked the silos, creeping toward an overpass with a sidewalk that promised a safer route back. The overpass had a sidewalk that started there and could be used as a safe route back to the car. Near it, an old office building sagged under its own weight, its windows boarded up. A chain-link fence, its gate ajar, offered a shortcut. A chain-link fence connecting to the building in Silo 3. We slipped through, our nerves frayed, but our mission intact. The silence was oppressive, broken only by our shallow breaths. We cleared the area, looping back to Silo 2, where Ethan spotted a narrow opening, barely 3 feet high, a cryptic 3-foot opening in Silo 2. Curiosity overrode fear. We flicked our flashlights on, revealing a door slightly ajar within, a door ajar within the opening. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but we didn't. The room beyond was suffocating, its walls stained with time. Blankets and water bottles littered the floor, remnants of someone's temporary home. Blankets and water bottles scattered around. We turned to leave, but a sound stopped us cold, a sharp, deliberate crack like a footstep on broken glass. There was a crunch. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friend. We kill our lights, the darkness swallowing us. Someone was close, too close. Immediately, we killed our lights and listened. The silence stretched unbearable. Finally, I peeked out, seeing nothing but shadows. I peeked my head out from the door and looked both left and right. We slipped out, moving between silos 1 and 2, desperate to escape the claustrophobic nightmare. Then headlights flooded the night, red beams dancing across the office building's wall. Headlights illuminated the wall of an old office building. We dove into the brush, hearts pounding. It was just a work truck, but it felt like a warning. It was just a work truck passing right in front of us. Shaken, we decided to call it quits, but Ethan insisted on a few photos. My friend suggested that we get a few pictures before departing. We snapped shots of the silos, their barred entries, a reminder of our limits. As we posed for a selfie, a noise, low, guttural, came from the room we'd just left. A strange noise that almost seemed to come from inside the room behind us. It wasn't human. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We decided it was time to pack up and head out. The railroads were our only way back, but fate had other plans. A train's rumble shook the ground, its bulk blocking our path, an actual train. The train passing by meant that our safest path back to the car would be blocked off. Ethan urged me forward, confident that it would pass. But it didn't. This train wasn't going anywhere. Another train followed, then a third, trapping us. Another train came and was braking on the tracks closest to us. Panic set in. We were exposed, vulnerable, with nowhere to hide. We were sitting ducks in an area where freeloaders and train hoppers ran rampant. An overpass in the distance offered hope, but the path was a nightmare of chest-high bushes. We had to stride through chest-high bushes and wild grasses. My shoe caught in the tangle, lost in the dark. The overgrowth managed to remove and swallow my shoe. We found it, but the relief was fleeting. Another train approached, its lights blinding. A horn sounded from behind us in the distance. We sprinted, outrunning the steel beast, collapsing beside the silos. We sprinted until we could hop off the tracks and return to the silos. The silos, once a threat, were now our refuge. The sinister place that was home to the dangerous and unknown had now become our safe haven. With no other choice, we crossed the chain-link fence again, aiming for the overpass sidewalk. We ventured over the fence. Halfway across, a sound pierced the night. Not a train, not a truck, but something alive, anguished and ominous. It came from the silos, then echoed from the houses beyond. It wasn't a rooster, it was a cry, human or not. We couldn't tell. We ran, our only goal, the silos' shadows chasing us into the dawn. The escape was a blur, our footsteps pounding the sidewalk as the overpass stretched endlessly before us. The silos hadn't just tested us, they'd marked us. Every rustle, every shadow felt like a reminder some places aren't meant to be explored. We reached the car, breathless, the engine's roar a lifeline. As we sped away, I glanced back. The silos stood unchanged, but something had shifted. They weren't just ruins, they were alive, waiting for the next fool to cross their tracks. Story number 21, The Whispering Shadows of Madagascar. You're alone in Madagascar's wilds, a young traveler chasing lemurs and adventure. But the forest feels alive, its shadows moving just out of sight. I am a fairly short female, and I was traveling alone in Madagascar at age 21 because I was on placement at a hospital in Mauritius for a month and decided to hop across to see some lemurs, speak French, and visit another African country. A whisper drifts through the trees, soft but urgent, calling your name in the dark. I was obviously a complete imbecile, as I had no idea what I would be in for. You follow, heart pounding, as it leads you deeper where no path should be. I traveled with around 2,000 Australian dollars, which were useless there as there were barely any banks and they wouldn't accept the Australian dollar checks, traveler checks, and almost no cash for safety. The air grows heavy, shadows shifting, and you run, the forest's voice chasing you. Thinking a few family trips to Europe meant I was worldly wise. You escape, but the whispers linger, a mystery in the Madagascar night that won't let go. Everything goes wrong. The forest watches, and its shadows move. I'm followed on the streets all the time and harassed non-stop. You're 21, fresh from a hospital placement in Mauritius, chasing lemurs in Madagascar. Naive but eager. I go to visit a tourist site out of the main town to avoid attention and get followed around by a self-appointed guide. A kid who tails me while trying badly to hide behind trees and then blocks my way and asks for payment as I try to leave. Your Australian dollars are useless. No banks, no exchanges, just you and your backpack in a foreign land. I pull out a crumpled $1 note and tell him I don't have more money because I'm scared of being robbed. The streets feel hostile, eyes trailing you, and you flee to a forest lodge, hoping for peace. He takes a look, a bit incredulous, but lets me go. You join a nighttime forest walk, the guide's eyes yellowed, his frame thin, offering a bike to explore the village. This time, I've had enough, and catch a bus to the countryside. You borrow it, expecting freedom, but the forest feels different, too quiet, too watchful. I stayed at a forest lodge and go on a nighttime forest walk, which may be illegal, and the guide offers to use one of his bikes to explore the village the following day. A whisper drifts from the trees, soft, almost your name, urging you forward. His eyes are yellow because he gets malaria every year, and he looks to be in his late 20s, but appears more in his early 30s. You follow, drawn to the sound, the shadow shifting just beyond your light, small, scrawny, and sick-looking. The whispers call, and the forest closes in. I turn up to borrow the bike, but then he says how he's coming with me. You ride the bike, the path winding up a hill, the forest denser, the whisper louder. Now a voice. Your heart races as it calls again, clearer, from a place with no lights, no paths. So I sit where he tells me in front of him on the bike with one broken pedal and start to think. The guide stops, speaking to someone unseen, and the air grows heavy, the voice insistent. We cycle around, then make our way up a big hill away from the village. You lie about a fiancé, hoping to deflect, but the whisper persists, not his, not human. He walks off to speak to his friends and returns and starts asking if I have a boyfriend and if I love him. You demand to leave, grabbing the bike, speeding down the hill, the voice chasing. I lie and say we are engaged. The guide's words fade, but the forests don't, echoing in your ears. He asks if in my culture we can have two boyfriends, and the friend is looking at me as he asks this. You reach the lodge, shaken. The receptionist warning of strange sounds in these woods. You freeze, the whispers circling, shadows moving in the dark, urging you to stay. We are not close to anyone or anything, and I ask him to leave, but he wants to stay. You lock your canvas hut, heart pounding, the forest alive with unseen eyes. I feel really uncomfortable. The shadows linger, and you flee the forest. So I grab the bike and dart down the hill. You're out of money, tears falling, until two travelers lend you $50 for a bus to the capital. He has to run after me. On the midnight ride, the bus halts. Soldiers boarding, searching for someone, their guns glinting. At the bottom, he points to a large field and tells me his dad lives in a hut on the other side, and he'll take me there to introduce us. You're spared, unnoticed, but the whispers echo in your mind, a warning, and I say no. You search online, finding forums, travelers in Madagascar hearing voices, seeing shadows in the trees. He tells me it's very offensive to refuse to meet family in his culture. A local speaks of forest spirits guiding or trapping wanderers, tied to ancient tales. And I say no again, and we ride back. You post your story, connecting with others who felt the forest's pull. Its whispers, too real. This time, me being on the front while he doesn't speak. You avoid jungles, live in a city, but check shadows. Fear the quiet. Back at the accommodation, which are canvas huts in the forest. The receptionist's warning, the soldiers, the whispers, they stay, a scar from Madagascar, a mystery of what called your name. The receptionist tells me that I shouldn't have gone with him. Story number 2, the unanswered call. The headset crackled, a woman screamed, piercing the quiet of the dispatch center. No, please, don't stop, she begged, her voice drowned by thumping bass and a roaring engine. My hands froze, my screen glowing, her panic a knife in my chest, and I was alone, racing against a clock I couldn't see. She didn't answer my questions, her cries fading into chaos. Then a man's voice, sharp, cruel, cursing her before the line went dead. My fingers flew, pinging her phone, but the dot moved fast, a ghost slipping through the night, out of my reach, out of my tongue. The air was heavy, the screens cold, my voice steady, but my heart pounding. I called a highway patrol, neighbors, anyone, but without a car, a name, I was blind, chasing a signal in a city too big, too dark, where screams vanish into silence. The ping stopped. A red dot in a bad part of town, 800 meters, 18 buildings, a maze of danger. I dialed back, got voicemail. Each unanswered ring await a question. Was she alive? Was she gone? The night ended, but her voice stayed, a shadow I couldn't shake. This wasn't just a call, not just a shift. It was a life, a loss, a void I couldn't fill. The dispatch center, my world, was now a place of ghosts, of screams unanswered, of questions that haunted my drive home, my dreams, my life. This last Thursday night, I took a call of a woman screaming. "Oh my God, no, please don't stop," screamed over a loud bass in a car engine. She wasn't answering any questions. Stayed on the line, trying to get info for over 6 minutes, until a male voice called her the B word for calling the cops and then hung up the phone. I pinged the phone, but it was moving too fast through multiple jurisdictions, and by the time I got the results on the first ping, it was already out of our venue. I checked previous history on the phone number, but there wasn't any. I ran the phone through a database we use to cross-reference information on phone numbers, names, criminal records, and restraining orders. Nothing. I also tried to get subscriber info so we could maybe contact someone who knows the owner of the phone, but it was a prepaid with no info on it. The screen was a dead end, the call a puzzle with no pieces, her voice a fading echo. I alerted the highway patrol in the neighboring jurisdiction, which is notoriously slow if I get any response at all. It took 7.5 minutes just to get to their emergency line, but without a vehicle description, it's pretty unlikely they're going to do anything about it. I mean, what are they supposed to do? Pull over every car with a loud bass in a particularly bad or high crime area? I continued plotting the recurring pings I set up, but they all stopped in one of the worst parts of the neighboring jurisdiction with a radius of 800 mi. Basically, 3 blocks containing 18 buildings, some with multiple floors. I tried calling it back a few times, but each call went straight to voicemail. The radio was silent, the night heavy, my hands useless against the void. Then my shift ended and I went home. I don't usually take calls home with me. Work stays at work as my motto, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions. I shake it all off at the door, get in my car and go be a good dad and husband. But this one's sticking with me no matter what. Her scream was a chain binding me to the call, to the questions I couldn't answer. I could tell you what it's like to listen to a child tell you about his mom being beaten by his dad in front of him, and I had to testify in court about that call. I could tell you about listening to a family perish screaming in a fire after an accident. I can tell you that if someone is reporting an ode happening in front of them, it has a particular note of desperation, unlike any other call, or what it's like to hear someone end their life on the phone with you, or try and comfort an adult who's just found their parent deceased. I've listened to a mother scream as she realized she accidentally ended the life of her infant. I have talked to frantic parents whose children were taken. Been at this job for a while, and I can tell you the time I spoke to a 15-year-old who had been shot and left for dead in a field because he tried to sell his older brother's weed. He survived, Or the guy who had been knifed multiple times and passed on the phone with 20 seconds before officers and paramedics showed up. Those were the rough calls, but at least I had some resolution to them. This one, nope, and I probably never will. Was it a woman being taken? Was her life being ended? Or was something horrific happening to her against her will? I have no idea. Could have been a partially disturbing song and a pocket dial for all I know. Was she found? Did she report what happened after? Is she alive now, or is she in an abandoned building? I don't know. Is there someone frantically searching for her right now? Did I ever meet her? Maybe, but I will never know. The questions piled up, a weight I carried out the door. Not knowing is the hardest part of this job. I go from the start of one emergency to another in seconds. Questions, dispatch, help, hang up, and repeat. In the rare case something really bothers me, I can usually ask the officer about his computer how it went, but I think I've only ever done that 2 or 3 times. This call, I'll never know how it ended or what happened. I did everything I could only for it to mean absolutely nothing. The screens went dark. The shift ended. But her voice stayed. A loop in my mind, a scream I couldn't quiet. Her scream followed me home, a ghost in my car, my house, my dreams. The dispatch center, my world, was now a place of unanswered calls, of lives I couldn't reach, of questions that tore at me, leaving me silent, haunted, waiting for the next ring. Anyway, now I'm sitting at home on my days off. My baby is crying, and my wife wants to tell me about some story or other she read on Reddit. Taxes are due, and I'm behind on paying bills a day or two. And all I want to do is go somewhere quiet, drink bourbon until I'm not stressed anymore. But that's a bad route to go. I've seen others do it, and I'd never forgive myself for letting my family down like that. So instead, I'm a little quieter than usual and maybe not as attentive as I'd like to be. But I'll be fine for another day or two. Just gotta suck it up and go back to work. 15 years until retirement. The house was loud, my wife's voice warm, my baby's cries a tether to life. But I was elsewhere, lost in her scream, in the ping that stopped, in the night that gave no answers. The days off were heavy, my mind replaying the call, her voice, the man's curse. I tried to shake it, to play with my kid, to laugh with my wife, but the questions lingered. Was she alive? Was she safe? Was she gone? I checked the news, the database, hoping for a trace, a name, anything, but found nothing. Just silence, just doubt. The job had taught me to move on, to let go. But this call was different, a wound that wouldn't close. I talked to a colleague, my words halting, the story spilling out in fragments. He nodded, his eyes tired, his stories of lost calls a mirror to mine. He'd heard screams too, voices cut off, lives unresolved. We didn't solve it, didn't heal it, but sharing it lightened the load, just a little. I read about dispatchers, their burnout, their ghosts, finding stories of calls that haunt, of voices that stay. Each was a reflection, a reminder I wasn't alone, but also a warning. The job takes, and it doesn't always give back. One night, I found a note in my pocket, a scribbled phone number from the call, my handwriting shaky. I stared at it, my heart racing, knowing I couldn't call. knowing it was voicemail, knowing she was gone. I kept it, a weight in my drawer, a piece of her scream. The phones will ring again, the screens will glow, but I'm marked now by her, by the call, by the answers I'll never have. Story number 23, The Smiling Man at BP. The highway hummed under my tires, a familiar pulse of asphalt and neon guiding me back to campus. I was 18, a college freshman, making the hour-long drive from home. The road a straight shot through a well-lit stretch of civilization. The night was clear, the stars drowned out by floodlights and billboards. I wasn't scared until I stopped. My gas gauge was flirting with empty, and a new BP station glowed just off the exit, its lot buzzing with late-night travelers. I pulled in, the promise of candy and a quick fill-up luring me out of my old Tahoe. Inside, the air was sharp with cleaner and coffee, but something felt off. The fluorescent lights buzzed too loudly, the aisles too narrow. I grabbed a pack of gummy worms, my eyes scanning the room. That's when I saw him, a middle-aged man, greasy hair, dark mustache, his smile too wide, too fixed. I noticed a greasy-looking man about middle-aged with dark hair and a mustache eyeing me up and smiling. It wasn't threatening, not yet, just a country grin, the kind you nod at and move on. I smiled back, paid, and headed out. Thanking the person holding the door, a voice said, "Thank you." It was him, standing too close, his eyes still on me. The lot was bright, but the shadows clung to him like a second skin. I hurried to my car, locked the door, cranked the engine, and leaned over the console to get my candy out the bag. My keys jangled. The engine's rumble a small comfort. Then a sound sharp, deliberate. Someone was tapping on my window. My head snapped up. It was him, the smiling man, his face inches from the glass, his hands dirt-streaked under the floodlights. He motioned for me to roll down my window. My stomach twisted. He was old enough to be my father. His grin now a leer, his eyes unblinking. I froze, my breath shallow, the world narrowing to his face. I tried to act confused and cupped my hand to my ear like, "What? I can't hear you," hoping he'd back off. He didn't. He cupped his hands around his mouth, pressed up against the window and said, "Roll down your window." My hands shook as I racked it, just a sliver. The Tahoe's height, putting our faces level. His breath fogged the glass, sour and warm. His fingers crawled up the side and slithered through the small window crack and into the car. I couldn't move, couldn't think, my mind screaming to stay calm. He shifted, his boots scraping the running board, his weight making the car groan. He shifted his weight up onto the lift step and did a sort of pull-up on the window to bring his eyes up to the opening. His smile widened, teeth yellowed, his voice low and oily. "You want to come play strip poker?" My heart stopped. Confusion and terror collided, a deer in headlights moment where words failed. I said, "Wait, what?" Trying to buy time, my voice barely a whisper. He laughed, a guttural sound, and bounced himself on the car step, making my car bounce along with him. The station's lights seemed to dim, the crowd oblivious to the nightmare unfolding. I was trapped, my mind racing for an escape. He repeated himself, his hands pressing harder, turning white as he tried to push down on the window. A horn blared, and for a split second, I thought help had come. It was a bunch of his friends telling him to hurry up and get me to come with them. Their car, a rusted heap spewing smoke, idled nearby, shadows moving inside, laughing. "Come on, girl, it'll be fun. We won't bite," they called, their voices sharp with mockery. My chest tightened. I forced a smile, playing dumb. "Ah, shucks. I'm sorry, but I really have to get back. Maybe next time." Though he didn't budge. He reached down to pull open the door handle, but thank God it was locked. His grin twisted, his words dripping with menace. "Oh, come on, little girl. I bet you ain't never been with a real man now. Sweet." My blood ran cold. I doubled down, my voice high and fake. "So funny? No, I really got to go. But thanks, though. Y'all go have fun." I shifted into reverse, praying he'd step back. He said, "You sure, baby?" Tilted his head, and then, God, the memory still churns my stomach, pushed his mouth into the window, forcing his tongue inside, smearing the glass with spit. I gagged, my hands fumbling for the gear. I said, "It's so hard to turn down. Thanks for the invite, though I'm flattered," my voice shaking but firm. He laughed, stepping down, his weight lifting from the car. "Your loss," he said, shrugging, and walked back to the smoke-plumed jalopy, full of his horrible friends. I floored it, tires screeching, the BP's lights fading in my rear view. My hands gripped the wheel, tears burning eyes. Then headlights flared behind me. I saw them coming up right behind me. The jalopy was there, its engine rattling, smoke curling from its windows. I could make out at least 3 men moving around and laughing inside. I pushed the Tahoe to 90, weaving through sparse traffic, my heart pounding. I sped up, hoping I'd lose them, or better yet, be pulled over by a cop. The highway stretched on, endless, the jalopy's lights flickering in my mirror. I prayed for a patrol car, a truck stop, anything. After what felt like forever, probably no more than a few seconds, I glanced back. Their vehicle was no longer there. Gone, like they'd never been. I didn't slow down until I reached campus, locking myself in my dorm, sobbing into my friend's arms. The next day, I called the campus police, my voice still raw. They took a report, but the BP was out of their jurisdiction. I called the county sheriff, describing the man, the car, the friends. They sent a deputy to check, but the station was clean, no jalopy, no men, just a busy lot under bright lights. The clerk remembered me buying candy, but hadn't seen the man. I felt crazy, like I'd imagined it, but the spit on my window, the dent in my running board, they were real. I had my dad check the Tahoe. He found scuff marks where the man had climbed, faint, but there. I stopped driving alone at night. The highway lost its comfort, its lights no longer safe. I researched the area, scouring X and local news for anything, a drifter, a gang, a report. Nothing matched, but I found a forum post about a smiling man at gas stations in the region. Always at night, always with friends, always gone by morning, No proof, just stories. But they chilled me. Was he a predator? A ghost? Something worse? I didn't want to know. Well, the memory festers. Even now, I see his face in crowds, his grin in shadows. My dorm mates noticed I changed, quieter, jumpier, always checking my locks. I started carrying mace, practicing what I'd say if it happened again. No more dumb girl routine, no more politeness. The moral of the story, don't be polite. The world doesn't reward it. That man, those men, they saw my smile as weakness, my youth as prey. I was lucky, but luck isn't a plan. I still drive to campus sometimes, but never at night, never alone. The BP is still there, its lights as bright as ever, but I don't stop. I fill up in town, keep my tank full, my door's locked. The smiling man is out there, I think, waiting at some other station, his tongue ready to taste the glass, his friends laughing in the dark, and I'll be damned if I give him another chance. Story number 24, The Blue Girl's Shadow. The backyard was our daughter's kingdom, a small patch of grass and toys where she could forget the world's weight. She'd been sick, her tiny body fighting a fever that left us sleepless. Now, with color back in her cheeks, we thought the worst was over. My wife sat on the back step, watching her play, the sun warm and the air soft with spring. But something shifted that day, a chill that didn't belong, a feeling that the world wasn't as empty as it seemed. Our daughter, barely 3, ran toward the slide, her laughter bright. She stopped, her head tilting, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. She turned to my wife, her eyes did with innocent certainty, and asked to play with someone my wife couldn't see. The slide stood alone, its red plastic gleaming, but our daughter saw more. My wife's smile faltered, her gaze sweeping the empty yard, finding nothing but grass and shadows. The air grew heavy, the sunlight dimming just a fraction. She tried to brush it off, to keep the moment light, but our daughter's voice was insistent, her words clear. She pointed to the slide, describing a girl, small like her, but wrong, cloaked in blue. Not just her clothes, but her very being. My wife's heart raced, her instinct screaming that this wasn't imagination. She stood, pulling our daughter close, and suggested they go inside, away from the yard that now felt too open, too watched. My wife was sitting on the back step, and my daughter came up and asked her if she could play with the little girl on our slide. My wife said, "I don't see a little girl." And my daughter said, "She's right over there on the slide. Mom, can't I play with her?" The words hung in the air, simple but chilling. My wife said, "I don't see anyone." But my daughter insisted. "She is. She's on the slide and she's blue. Can I play with her?" My wife's hands trembled as she guided our daughter inside, her eyes darting back to the empty slide. My wife freaked out and said, "Let's go inside and make a snack." So they did. The kitchen felt safer, its walls a barrier against whatever lingered outside. But our daughter wasn't done. She pressed her face to the glass door, her small hands smudging the pane, staring at the slide. For the rest of the day, my daughter kept going out to looking at the back door and kept telling my wife that the little blue girl was lonely. Her voice was soft, I came home to find them in the kitchen, my wife's face pale, our daughter drawing pictures of a blue figure. She spoke of the girl like a friend, someone waiting for her. We checked the yard together, finding nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone. But the slide seemed different now, its shadow longer, its presence heavier. That night, our daughter slept between us, her small body warm but restless. I lay awake, wondering what she'd seen, what she'd felt. Was it a child's imagination? Or had something reached out, lonely and lost, seeking her?